Alden had 30 days left to turn the land allotted to him into a thriving settlement with water, bread, and a garrison. If, after 30 days, his banner did not fly over a functioning settlement, the Council of Trials would strike him from the list of rulers and send him to the mines of the vanquished. For the rest of his life, 9 out of 10 contenders from the previous generation had ended up there, and no one ever spoke their names aloud again. Alden stood in line at the Obelisk of Division, watching the backs of those walking ahead of him. The obelisk was a black stone, 4 times the height of a man. Once a generation, it bestowed combat talents upon the contenders, granting them through touch. Each contender placed a palm on the stone and received the power with which he would have to hold his ground. A contender named Garek stepped away from the stone with his hands ablaze, and the crowd roared with approval. He had been granted the talent of the fiery strike. Next, a girl from House Vale received the talent of bodily acceleration and sliced and tossed Apple in half before it had a chance to fall. The crowd roared. Alden was the last to approach the stone. He placed his palm on the cold surface and closed his eyes. The power flowed into him without heat or a roar. A map unfolded before his inner eye. First, it covered 100 paces around him, then 10 miles. Then the map expanded to 1,000 kilometers in every direction, and Alden could barely stay on his feet. He saw veins of iron beneath the hills. He saw underground rivers and lakes. He saw monster layers marked by crimson dots and abandoned treasure vaults of the ancients marked by golden sparks. He saw everything that lay in the earth and on the earth, but he could not lift even a pebble with this power. Magister Holden, the chief overseer of the trial, asked him to demonstrate his talent. Alden said that his gift revealed water or monsters and treasures within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. Silence hung over the square. Then someone laughed. Soon, the entire square was laughing. Garrick shouted through the laughter that the council had appointed a surveyor as their ruler. Holden raised his hand, and the laughter subsided. The magister said that the stone never errs, but for the first time in his service, the stone had identified a talent in a contender that had no combat application whatsoever. He said that, according to the rules, the selection of land proceeds in order of the strength of the talent and that Alden would choose last. Alden nodded silently. The laughing claimants divided up the valleys with black soil and the banks of the navigable Halda River. Garrick took the vineyard terraces of the south. A warrior named Kargan, with a wolf fur cloak draped over his shoulders, took the Green Merle Valley with its 2 villages and a ford. When it was Alden's turn, only the Ash Hills remained on the council map. Gray earth without a single river on the surface. No forest, no villages. Holden asked if the contender would prefer to withdraw from the trial immediately and preserve his life as a commoner. Alden was looking not at the council map, but at his inner map. Beneath the Ash Hills, 40 paces deep, flowed an underground river as wide as a city street. In the northern slope lay an iron vein, so dense that his inner map shaded it in a solid dark color. And through the saddle between the hills ran the only route by which caravans could take a shortcut between the eastern and western highways, bypassing the bandit-infested gorges. Alden said he was taking the Ash Hills. For the first time that day, Holden's expression changed, but he quickly regained his composure and struck a rock with his staff to confirm the decision. The next morning, Alden left the gates of the capital of the trial with a caravan of 11 people. These were the ones no one else had taken in. Old blacksmith Bertolf with a broken arm, the baker's widow, Anna with her 2 sons, Rash, a convict released for good service. The rest were debtors and fugitives. The caravan's guide, Sergeant Joss, agreed to lead them to the hills for a fee and made no secret of the fact that he considered this his last job working with living people. He told Alden that there was no water in the Ash Hills and that the caravan would come to a standstill there within a week. Alden replied that they would have water by evening on the 3rd day. Joss smirked and didn't speak to him again until they reached the hills. The journey took 3 days. On the 3rd evening, the wagon train entered the saddle, and the people saw their new domain, gray slopes, dust, and gnarled blackthorn bushes. Anna pulled her sons close and wept silently. Alden walked 200 paces east of the saddle and stopped at the spot where his map indicated the thinnest part of the vault over the underground river. He thrust his shovel into the ground and ordered them to dig there. Rask asked why they should waste the strength of dying men on a hole in the desert. Alden said there was a river beneath them and that it was 12 paces away through a layer of soft soil. The men dug because they had no choice. By nightfall, the pit had deepened by 10 paces. Joss stood at the edge, holding a torch. He planned to take his mules and leave in the morning. On the 12th step, Rask's shovel broke through, and water gushed out of the hole. It was cold and clear, and it rose up. The men shouted, scooped it up with their hands, and poured it over their heads. Joss stood with the torch looking at the water and then at Alden. The foreman slowly took off his cap. He said he'd been leading caravans for 30 years and knew these hills like the back of his hand and that there had never been water here. He said he wouldn't leave in the morning. He said he wanted to see what this surveyor would find next. Alden nodded and looked north where an iron vein lay beneath the slope. Then he shifted his inner gaze further on, and what he saw wiped the smile from his face. The crimson dot marking the nest of the ash snakes 20 miles to the north had begun to move. The dot was splitting. 1 point became 3. The nest was waking from its winter hibernation a month ahead of schedule, and from the south, toward the border of the ash hills, another mark was slowly creeping forward. These were not monsters. These were horsemen. A dozen horsemen bearing the emblem of the wolf's cloak were riding along his border and surveying his land. Kargan from the Merle Valley had sent scouts to the neighbor whom the entire region mocked. Alden stood above the well from which his men drank their first water and realized a simple truth. 30 days to survive had been just the first count. The real count was beginning right now, and in it, the price of a mistake was measured not in mines, but in graves. He ordered Bertolf to begin building a log cabin over the well at dawn, and Rasku to gather everyone who could hold even a stick. The night over the ash hills was quiet, but on Alden's inner map, dots were moving in the darkness, and each one was heading toward his land. At the obelisk, Alden had received a non-combat talent that allowed him to see all monster resources and treasures within a radius of 1,000 kilometers, and his final choice had been the despised Ashen Hills, beneath which lay a hidden underground river, an iron vein, and a future trade route through the saddle. He had 30 days to establish a functioning settlement, otherwise he would be sent to the mines. The first well yielded water and convinced Chief Joss to stay, but the nest of ash snakes to the north had awakened ahead of schedule, and Lord Kargan's scouts were already surveying the border of his land. Dawn found Alden on the northern ridge, from where he watched Kargan's horsemen. A dozen riders rode along the base of the hills, drove 2 stakes with wolf skulls into the old boundary line, and rode south without approaching the camp. Joss said that this was how the wolf cloaks marked the land they intended to claim. Alden replied that according to the law of the trial, the land belonged to whoever placed the council's boundary stones on it, and that the stones would be set before Kargan could muster his forces. According to the rules, each claimant received 12 boundary stones and could place them anywhere within the unclaimed lands adjacent to his allotment. Most lords placed the stones around their farmlands and villages. Alden spread a piece of canvas on the ground and drew his mental map from memory using charcoal. He mentally placed the first stone on the northern slope where the iron vein lay, the second on the saddle of the future trade route, the third on the dry riverbed where the map showed a tin ore deposit, the fourth on the hill beneath which lay a speck of gold from an ancient burial site, the fifth on the only source of clay suitable for bricks in the area. He arranged the remaining 7 in a chain so that the boundary covered the second outlet of the underground river and both hills, from which the entire surrounding area was visible. Rask looked at the canvas and shook his head. He said that none of these stones stood on land where even a single edible plant grew. Alden replied that bread could be bought, but a vein could not. Setting the stones in place took 4 days. The men carried the stones on sleds, and Alden personally checked each point against the internal map. On the 5th day, the council overseer arrived at the camp with a scribe. He verified the stones' positions against the layout, read aloud that the claimant Alden had secured 60 square miles of wasteland for himself, and couldn't resist remarking that this was the first time the council had registered a claim consisting of bare rocks and dust. The clerk chuckled. The supervisor entered Alden into the registry as the last of 22 claimants. That same evening, Alden took Bertolf to the northern slope and ordered him to dig a test pit at the designated spot. The blacksmith grumbled that digging on a dry slope was foolish. On the 3rd strike of the pickaxe, the rock gave way in brown layers. Bertolf held a piece up to his eyes, spat on it, rubbed it, and froze. Then He sat down right on the pile and remained silent for a long time. He said he'd been working with ore for 40 years and had never seen ore of such purity, not even in the imperial warehouses. He said that this stone could be used to cast not nails but blades, the kind paid for in silver by weight. Alden ordered him to build a furnace out of local clay and not to tell anyone outside the hills about the discovery. Next, he needed manpower. He sent Joss to the capital of the trial with a simple offer for anyone left out in the cold by foreign powers: food, shelter, and a share in the venture for anyone who came to work. Joss returned a week later and brought 40 men. Once again, they were the ones no one else would take. Lame masons, bankrupt tenants, 2 families of charcoal burners whom Garrick had driven from his terraces. Alden accepted them all and within the first hour showed each one the well with clean water. Work began, stringing together days that blurred into one. Here, Bertolf is pulling the first brick from the first firing, and the apprentices are shouting with delight. Here, Mana is setting up a clay oven and baking bread for all 100 mouths from grain bought with Alden's last silver. Here is Rash with his crew of 10 finishing the palisade around the well hill and hanging a piece of iron above the gate in place of a bell. Here, the first 2 houses are going up on the saddle, and Joss is staking out the site for an inn, even though there is no road across the saddle yet, and the merchants know nothing of it. People laughed at these markings. Joss replied that they'd laughed at the well too. By the end of the 3rd week, 90 people were living in the settlement. Every evening, Alden climbed to the ridge and studied the inner map. The crimson dots of the snake's nest were multiplying and spreading across the northern ravines, but so far they hadn't come closer than 10 miles. However, something he'd been waiting for had appeared on the map. A large caravan was traveling along the eastern route, heading toward the bandit-infested gorges where the map indicated an ambush by 12.5 men. Alden took Joss and 2 of his men and intercepted the caravan at a fork in the road a day before they reached the gorges. He told the caravan leader that an ambush awaited him in the gorges, and that there was a shorter and safer route through the heart of the Ash Hills, where the caravan could get water and lodging for a reasonable fee. The caravan leader stared for a long time at the dusty young lord, then at his own guards, of whom there were only 6. He asked how Alden could have known about the ambush. Joss replied that his lord knew everything about this land, and that he, Joss the foreman, who had been leading caravans for 30 years, would stake his reputation on it. The caravan turned toward the saddle. That night, Alden's men showed the merchants a well and fed them Anna's bread, while Bertolf sold the caravan leader 20 knives from the first smelting. In the morning, the caravan leader weighed a knife in his palm and said he would pay for their right of passage through the saddle in advance for his next 3 caravans. He said that with such iron and such water, there would be a town here in a year's time, and that he wanted to be the first to know about it. Thus, Alden's estate received its first trading revenue. And on the 28th day, the council inspector arrived for the final inspection. He rode through the gate, ready to dictate his verdict to the scribe, and stopped his horse in the middle of the street. He looked at the palisade, the smoking smelter, the inn with strangers' wagons, the 90 well-fed people, and the barrel by the gate from which any traveler could drink for free. The scribe double-checked the estate number, thinking they must have gone to the wrong valley. The inspector walked silently to the well, peered into it, and stood over the water for a long time. Then he dictated to the scribe that estate number 22 had passed the survival test. His voice, as he spoke, sounded like that of a man reading someone else's handwriting aloud. By evening of that same day, the joy had ended. An internal map showed Alden that a detachment of 50-foot soldiers with a supply train was moving from Merle Valley toward his southern border. This was not yet a war. It was a diplomatic mission backed by military force. And from the north, the crimson dots of ash-colored snakes crossed the 10-mile line for the first time in a month and moved toward the iron slope where the smelter clanged day and night. The smell of smoke and people beckoned them like a bell calling for dinner. Alden stood on the ridge between 2 looming calamities and realized he would only have time to prepare for one. Alden set boundary stones not around the farmland, but over the iron vein of tin and clay, the ancient burial site, and the saddle of the future trade route, thereby securing 60 miles of wasteland and becoming the last in the registry of 22 claimants. Within a month, the settlement had acquired a smelter with ore of unprecedented purity, a stockade, 90 residents, and its first trade earnings from a caravan that had been led away from an ambush. The council overseer deemed the trial passed. Now, from the south toward the border, a detachment of 50 men led by Kargan is advancing with an embassy, while from the north, the awakened Ash Grey, and Alden has time to prepare for only one threat. Alden chose the snakes. He reasoned that the embassy was coming to talk, while the snakes were coming to eat, and that negotiations could be weathered with words. But fangs cannot be stopped by words. The internal map showed 7 crimson dots slithering toward the iron slope in a wide arc. An adult ash snake reached 5 paces in length and could pierce an ox hide with its fangs. Against them, Alden had 20 men armed with spears made of fresh iron, and one advantage that no one else on the continent possessed. He knew where the enemy would be tomorrow. The map showed not only the locations but also the dry riverbed along which the snakes were heading toward the smelter, avoiding the open ridges. Alden ordered them not to wait for the snakes at the palisade. He ordered them to meet the snakes where the dry riverbed narrowed between 2 clay cliffs. That night, Raska's men staked the bottom of the gorge with stakes, blocked the exit with carts at an angle, and hoisted baskets of stones up onto the cliffs. The snakes were not killed in fair combat. They were met from above with stones and spears in the gorge, where the creatures could not form their coils. By noon, it was all over. 7 carcasses lay impaled on the stakes, and not a single one of Alden's men had suffered even a scratch. Bertolf stripped the hides from the beasts, hides that were worthless to saddlers, and Anna rendered the fat from their spines for lamps. Rask stood over the carcasses, talking aloud to himself. He said he'd been fighting for 10 years and that things like this just didn't happen. He said an ambush works when you know the enemy's route, but no one knew the enemy's route. Then he gave Alden a long look, but asked nothing. That evening, a delegation from Kargan approached the gates. 50-foot soldiers set up camp within arrow's range, and 3 entered the gates. The eldest of them wore a wolf fur cloak over chainmail and identified himself as Captain Dorn. He conveyed his lord's message. Kargan declared that the Ash Hills had always belonged to the Murl Valley, that the water found there had been obtained through sorcery, and that sorcery was prohibited by law at the trial. Lord Kargan offered his neighbor a choice. Either Alden would acknowledge himself as a vassal, pay half his income, and grant the wolf cloaks free passage through the saddle, or Lord Kargan would file a complaint with the council regarding sorcery, and pending the investigation, seize the disputed land by force, as custom permits. Dorn spoke calmly, looking not at Alden but at the smelter, the palisade, and the fresh snake skins stretched across the stakes. His gaze was sharp and calculating. Alden replied that the water had been found with a shovel, not by sorcery, that the land was secured by the council stones, and that he would not be a vassal. He said he would send Lord Kargan a return gift, and ordered that a snake skin 5 paces long be brought out to Dorn. He said that his men killed such creatures without suffering any losses, and that their nest was in the hills. Let Lord Kargan decide for himself whether half the war revenue is worth it for a land where such creatures peer out from every ravine. Dorn accepted the skin, weighed it in his hands, and looked Alden in the eye for the first time. He said he would relay everything word for word. At the gate, he turned around and added of his own accord that his lord would file a complaint about witchcraft in any case, because such a complaint was worthless. The embassy headed south, and 2 days later, Alden's inner map revealed what had made him forget about Kargan. In the northeast, 100 miles from the hills in the upper reaches of the Halda River, storm fronts were converging. Alden did not see the weather itself, but he saw the water, and he saw how, over the course of 3 days, the underground horizons of the headwaters swelled like a sponge and how the water began to overflow its banks. According to his map, in 4 days, the Haldi would burst its banks and strike all the riverside settlements at once. 8 claimants were settled along the banks of the Halda, including Garrick with his terraces at the lower ford. Thousands of people lived there. Alden gathered his people and told them that in 4 days, the river would wash away their neighbors. Joss asked what business it was of theirs if the neighbors had been laughing at them. Alden replied that after the flood, thousands of people would be left homeless, and that these people would go wherever there was water, bread, and walls. He ordered Anna to use all their trade funds to buy up grain in the capital of the trial while it was still cheap. He ordered Rask to prepare shelters and mark out land for new houses, and he himself sat down and wrote 8 identical letters. In the letters, he informed each coastal lord that within 4 days the Halda would rise to the level of the old temple, and advised them to lead their people and livestock to higher ground. He asked for nothing in return, Joss delivered the letters personally. 7 lords burned the letters or mocked the messenger. Garrick ordered the dogs to be set upon Joss and shouted after him that a surveyor from the desert had decided to lecture him on life. Only the elderly Lady Maeve from the upper ford silently read the letter, looked at her engineer, and ordered the livestock to be driven to the hills. Her engineer was the sullen master Marin, who had spent half his life building dams. Marin told his mistress in front of the messenger that no mortal could predict a flood 4 days in advance, and that if the water reached the old temple, he would eat his own hat. On the 4th day, Halda reared up. The water had come during the night in a broad wall, sweeping away the lower ford, washing away Garrick's terraces along with the wine presses, and stopping right at the steps of the old temple. 8 estates had turned into a swamp overnight. The dead were counted in the hundreds. And the next morning, people began streaming along the muddy roads toward the ash hills. They were walking because word had already spread among the refugees about the lord who had written 8 letters. Alden welcomed everyone, just as he had welcomed debtors and fugitives. A month earlier, food, water, and a share in the common cause. Within a week, the population of the hills had grown from 90 to 700. Anna fed the lines of people with grain she'd bought in advance. Rask built street after street. Bertolf selected 40 men from among the new arrivals for the smelter and fired up a second furnace. Master Marin also arrived. He dismounted at the gate, approached Alden in front of everyone, took his hat out of his bog, and silently bit off a piece of the brim. He chewed it. Then he said that Lady Maeve had suffered no casualties and no loss of livestock, and that she had sent him to ask about one thing. He asked how. Alden replied that he saw deeper than others. Maron looked at him for a long time, then said that people don't usually have eyes like that, but that he, an old fool, wanted to build for someone who could see where the water would flow. He asked to be taken on, and Alden handed him all the hill construction projects. By the end of the week, the bad news Alden had been expecting arrived. The Council of Trials had accepted Lord Cargan's complaint of sorcery, and following the flood, 6 more similar complaints had been added from the coastal lords. Their logic was simple and terrifying. Whoever predicted the disaster was the one who brought it upon them. Garrick shouted at the council that the desert surveyor had flooded his terraces to steal his people. The council scheduled a hearing and, pending the outcome, prohibited Alden from expanding his borders. Meanwhile, the internal map showed that Cargan had not waited for the decision. The wolf cloaks were gathering at the southern border, and there were no longer just 50 of them. There were 300 of them, and a convoy carrying ladders was moving with them. Alden, without suffering any losses, exterminated 7 ash serpents in a prepared gorge, rejected Cargan's ultimatum, delivered by Captain Dorn, and sent a warning to the 8 coastal lords about the Halda flood, a warning that only Lady Maeve took seriously. The flood devastated 7 estates, after which the population of the hills grew from 90 to 700 people. And engineer Marin, having eaten the brim of his own hat, entered Alden's service. The council accepted complaints of sorcery and forbade Alden from expanding his borders, while Cargan, without waiting for an investigation, gathered 300 fighters with siege ladders at the southern border. 300 against 700 mouths to feed, of whom only 150 untrained men could bear arms. Alden studied this situation on his map every hour. The wolf cloaks had been stationed at the boundary for 4 days and had not crossed it. Dorn could see the palisade, and Cargan was waiting for the hills, now overflowing with refugees, to run out of bread. He was wrong about one thing. Anna had enough bread to last 2 months. But Alden had no intention of sitting under siege for 2 months, because he saw on the map what Cargan did not. He saw the path the wolf cloaks would take when they made their move. Between the Murl Valley and the hills lay 2 passes. The wide western one ran across an open plain under the watchful eyes of sentries, and Cargan would not have taken it. The narrow eastern one ran through dry ravines, where the crossing took a day, and where the army could approach the hills covertly, and in dry ravines, on Alden's map, the largest crimson spot in the area glowed. There, in the gullies, lay the main nest of the ash snakes. Not 7 creatures, more than 40. After the destruction of their small clutch, the snakes had gone into a deep hibernation during the bountiful season and left anyone alone who didn't come looking for them. Alden gathered Rask, Joss, and Marin and spread out a canvas with a map. He said that Kargan's army needed to be led through the Balki, and the nest stirred up. Rask asked how to lure a wolf into a pit. Alden replied that a wolf is led by its nose. The plan was built on greed. In the morning, a convoy of 6 wagons, accompanied by a small escort, emerged from the gates of the hills and set off along the eastern road toward the Balks. On the wagons lay crates with a top layer of strips of fresh iron, and beneath the strips lay stone. The convoy moved slowly, lighting campfires at every stop. Kargan sentries counted the wagons within an hour. By evening, Dorn had interrogated the captured cart driver. The driver was Joss, who had allowed himself to be captured, and who, in tears, explained that Lord Alden was secretly transporting the treasury and the finest iron along the eastern route to the capital of the Trial under the Council's protection before the war began. That night, the entire camp of the Wolfcloaks broke camp. Kargan could not let his neighbor's treasury slip away, nor could he allow the iron to fall into the council's hands. 300 men entered the dry ravines at dawn, stretching out along the bottom of the ravines in a column a mile long. They caught up with the wagon train by noon in the most remote bend of the ravines. The wagon train's guards scattered, abandoning their wagons. The Wolfcloaks opened the crates and found the stone, and at that very moment, signal smoke billowed from the gullies along the entire length of the column. Raska's men, who had spent the past day hiding in burrows along the edges of the Balki, set fire to piles of snake fat mixed with sulfur and rolled them into the mouths of the dormant gullies. Acrid smoke billowed into the nests. The awakened nest rose up all at once. 40 adult creatures emerged from underground right in the middle of the stretched-out column, which had nowhere to turn. Alden watched this from the ridge and saw on the map how crimson dots were cutting into the cluster of humans. He felt no joy. He ordered Rast not to finish off the fleeing creatures and to keep his men on the ridges no matter what happened below. Below, a massacre was taking place. The formation in the ravines was falling apart. Ladders and shields were being discarded. Those in the rear were crushing those in front. Within the first hour, Kargan had lost his banner and half his supply train, and by sunset he had led fewer than 1,500 men out of the Baylocks without supplies and without spirit. He himself headed south without looking back. And at the exit from the Baylocks, the remnants of his rearguard stumbled upon Rask's men who were standing across the road in a fresh formation with spears at the ready. Captain Dorn looked at this formation and at his staggering men and threw his sword to the ground. 42 Wolfcloaks surrendered without a fight. The prisoners were led up to the hills, fed, and Alden spoke with Dorn in private. Dorn asked how long Alden had known that the army would take the eastern route. Alden replied that he hadn't known but had arranged things so that there was no other way to go. Dorn was silent for a long time. Then he said that he had served Kargan for 8 years for pay, and that there would be no more pay because a lord without a treasury and without an army is no lord. He said he had seen how the hills slay serpents without suffering losses, how the hills feed 700 mouths under siege, and how the hills won the war without drawing a sword. He said that he wished to serve such a lord, not for pay, but for the sake of learning, and that his 40 men would say the same. Alden accepted their oath in the square by the well. Rack grumbled that letting wolves into the sheepfold was foolish. Joss replied that a month ago they themselves had been the sheepfold. It took a week to gather Bayloc's spoils. Kargan's abandoned wagon train provided the hills with 200 ladders, which Marin used to secure the rafters, along with 36 horses, 50 suits of chainmail, and the army treasury in an iron chest. And the council's investigation into the complaints of witchcraft ended of its own accord. The claimant who had filed the main complaint lost the campaign, having lost his army in a clash with monsters on no man's land, and, according to the code, forfeited his right to complain as the party that had initiated the seizure before the council's decision. The overseer read this ruling aloud in the hills before the people and rode off before they had a chance to invite him to the table. That evening, Alden climbed to the ridge with the internal map. The settlements glowed with lights below. The second smelter was smoking. 11 foreign caravans were already standing in the saddle because word of the safe route with water was spreading along the highways on its own. By any measure, it was a victory. And according to all the rules of his life, victory was followed by a bigger score. The map revealed it that very night. From the southwest, beyond the borders of the lands of trial, a column unlike any Alden had ever seen was moving toward the hills. 1,500 people, a wagon train of 400 carts, and it bore a symbol that no one in the lands of trial possessed. These were not contenders. Joss, glancing from the ridge at the distant lights, turned pale and said he recognized those square tents. That was how Duke Ferrand, master of the western coast and half the continent's maritime trade, set up camp, a man to whom the council of the trial itself paid for peace. Joss didn't know why the Duke needed a wasteland at the edge of the map. Alden knew. He scanned the Duke's column with his inner vision and saw that it wasn't heading toward the hills. It was heading toward a point 30 miles to the south, toward the hill beneath, which Alden had spotted a golden spark from an ancient burial site during the very first week. Only now, looking more closely, did he realize his mistake. It wasn't a spark. Beneath that hill, 100 paces deep, an entire city was ablaze with golden light. Alden, using a decoy wagon train with a fake prisoner Joss, lured 300 Kargan into dry ravines, where he used smoke to rouse a nest of 40 ash snakes and destroyed the army without engaging in battle. Afterward, Captain Dorn and 42 fighters swore allegiance to the hills, and the accusation of witchcraft was nullified by the complainants. The hills received the captured wagon train, the treasury, horses, and chainmail, while the caravans themselves continued through the saddle. At night, the map revealed Duke Ferrand's column of 1,500 men marching toward a hill 30 miles to the south, beneath which Alden discerned the buried golden city of the ancients. The buried city lay beyond his boundary stones, on no man's land, and in 6 days the Duke's column was to set up camp above it. All night long, Alden's mind's eye traced the golden lines beneath the hill, and by morning, he knew more about the discovery than Ferrand's scouts had learned in years. He saw the outlines of the halls and streets. He saw that there were 2 entrances to the city, a large, collapsed shaft on the southern slope toward which the Duke's column was heading, and a natural passageway as narrow as a needle on the northern side, leading from a dry riverbed within its own boundaries. The passage began 40 paces from his 7th boundary stone. Formally, anything a person unearths from beneath his own land belongs to him by council decree. Alden convened the Council of the Hills. He said that the Duke would be digging the southern shaft for months because the vaults there lay in a collapse upon a collapse. He said that the northern tunnel led to the city's upper halls in 8 days of careful digging. Marin studied his sketches and confirmed that with the support scaffolding in place, they could get through even faster. The Kargan stairs were being repurposed once again. By day, the Hills went about their usual business and received caravans. At night, Marin and a dozen trusted men reinforced the passage and ventured deeper and deeper underground. Alden guided them using a map from the surface, marking each turn with knots on a rope. On the 6th night, Marin returned from underground with the look of a man who had peered over the edge of the world. He laid 3 items on the table in front of Alden: a bar of white metal, heavier lead, a plate inscribed with characters no one recognized, and a handful of pure gold coins bearing the profile of a non-human face. He said that the upper chamber was the size of the capital's market square, and that there were dozens of such chambers below. Alden ordered them to take only the gold for now, and only from the upper chamber. The white metal and the inscriptions were not to be touched until the time was right. He understood that wealth which cannot be defended is not wealth but a death sentence, and that the thousands of the Duke's men 30 miles away made this truth all too clear. The gold went into circulation immediately, but not as gold. Through Joss and the caravan leaders, the Hills began buying up along all the trade routes whatever could not be grown on the wasteland. Grain in large shipments, timber, weapons, and men. Dorn received the treasury and a blank check to hire veterans from all the free lands. By the end of the month, he had 400 trained spearmen and 100 archers under his command. Meanwhile, Ferrand's camp had been set up above the southern pit, and the Duke's diggers had dug their way into the cave-ins. The Duke sent a polite embassy to the Hills to purchase provisions for his army, and Alden politely sold him bread at triple the price. Both sides smiled, and both sides did the math. Ferrand had been stationed above the shaft for 7 weeks. His men had passed through 3 cave-ins and were now stuck at the 4th, and then his engineers noticed what they were bound to notice sooner or later. Someone had been in the upper chambers before them. Fresh timber work, traces of stretchers, empty niches where, by all appearances, gold had once lain. The trail led to the northern entrance and ended at the boundary markers of estate number 22. The Duke's embassy arrived in the Hills for the 2nd time, and this time it was no longer polite. The ambassador read out the demand. Lord Alden was to return everything seized from the city of the ancients, hand over the northern passage to the Duke, and allow his men onto his land for inspection. Otherwise, the Duke would declare him a plunderer of another's find and close all Western trade routes and seaports to the hills. The ambassador added that without Western trade, the hills would perish within a season. Alden replied calmly, "Everything unearthed from beneath his land and transported through his territory belongs to him by decree of the council. There will be no inspection. As for the trade routes, the ambassador may convey to the Duke that a road is not necessarily where it is marked on a map. A road is wherever it is safe and profitable for a merchant." The ambassador left, and a week later, the Duke's decree was carried out. The western trade routes were closed to any caravan traveling through the hills. Ferran's checkpoints turned merchants back and added their names to the port's blacklists. The caravan leaders came to Alden looking gloomy and said that, for all their love of his water and his prices, they could not trade at a loss. And then Alden laid out a new map before them. All this time, his gaze had been searching the mountains of the western range for what was supposed to be there, and he found it, an old pass south of the Duke's outposts. Forgotten since the days of ancient wars, blocked in 2 places but passable after clearing, and most importantly, leading to the free port of Selvin, which was not under the Duke's control. Marin, with captured ladders and 200 workers, cleared the blockages in 3 weeks. 2 blockhouses manned by Dorn's archers were erected at the pass, along with a well dug exactly according to Alden's map at the only spot where water flowed beneath the pass. The first caravan traveled the new route and returned from Selvin with a higher profit than before, because the route turned out to be 4 days shorter than the Duke's roads. Then a force came into play that no checkpoints could stop. Merchants went where the route was shorter and cheaper. Within a month, more goods passed through the saddle and the pass than through the Duke's western routes, and Ferran's customs ledgers took such a hit that people began talking about it in the ports. The Duke had intended to block Alden's path, but it turned out that Alden had opened a path past the Duke. Master Holden arrived in the hills, the very same man who, half a year earlier, had urged the surveyor to renounce the trial and spare the life of a commoner. The council had sent him for the annual audit, and Holden carried with him a prepared report on 22 estates, 8 of which had been washed away by the river, 1 had fallen in the war, and the rest were barely scraping by. He rode into the saddle at sunset and reined in his horse. Before him lay a city, not a village or a camp, but a city of 3,000 inhabitants with stone warehouses, 2 smelting works, a market square where the languages of the 6 lands were spoken, and the Marin water tower rising above it all. Holden dismounted and walked down the street. He ran his hand over the stonework. He looked at the stalls where goods banned by the Duke were being sold openly. He stopped at the well square, where Selvin's prices from the previous day were written in chalk on a board. The scribe asked him what to include in the report. Holden replied that the entire report would have to be rewritten. That evening, the magistrate sat with Alden and spoke bluntly. He said that the council was on his side, and the council always sides with whoever pays their taxes most diligently. But he said something else as well. Ferran had lost both his reputation and his money, and for someone like Ferran, a lost reputation can only be washed away with iron. The Duke is now openly recruiting an army and taking everyone. By spring, he'll have 5,000 men, and he'll have any excuse he needs. Holden asked if Alden understood that all his victories had led to this, that each of his successes had made the next enemy greater, and that the next enemy was no longer a pretender in a wolf fur cloak, but the ruler of half the coast. Alden replied that he understood this better than anyone, because he'd seen this path from day one. The night after the magistrate's departure, he climbed to the ridge and expanded his inner vision to a full 1,000 kilometers. He looked at Ferran's camps, where the number of dots was growing with each passing week. He looked at his own mountain passes and his own veins, and then his gaze was caught by something he had never looked at before, because he hadn't been searching for it. Deep beneath the western coast, right beneath the Duke's ports and castles, the map showed a void. Not ancient halls nor caves, a vast, flat void the size of an entire duchy, which breathed slowly. Every few minutes, its edge would rise and fall, and with every such breath, the water of all the coastal horizons receded from it, just as a hand recedes from something hot. Alden stood on the crest until dawn, and for the first time during the entire trial, he did not understand what he was seeing. He knew only 2 facts. The Duke's 5,000 men would assemble by spring, and whatever lay dormant beneath the Duke's lands was awakening faster. Alden, using a secret northern passage within his own borders, was the first to enter the buried Golden City. He took the gold from the upper hall, and using it, hired 500 veterans through Dorne, purchased grain and timber, while Duke Ferran spent 7 weeks battling his way through the collapses of the southern shaft. In response to the Duke's trade blockade, Alden cleared the forgotten pass to the free port of Selvine, rerouted the merchants via a shorter path, and ruined the Duke's customs revenues. And Magistrate Holden's audit recognized the hills as a city of 3,000 inhabitants and the first domain of the trial. Ferran is openly mustering an army of 5,000 by spring, and an internal map revealed a gigantic, breathing void beneath his coastal lands, one that is awakening and from which all underground water is receding. There were 4 months left until spring, and Alden had mapped out each of them week by week, just as Marin maps out masonry row by row. The Duke's 5,000 men could not be defeated in open battle, nor could they be outlasted behind a palisade, because a palisade against the coast's siege engines would hold for days, not months. The only path left was the one Alden had been following from day one, to make war more costly for the enemy than peace. He began with stone. Maron was given a task that he himself called insane, and one that made his eyes light up: to encircle the city with a wall before spring. Any engineer on the continent would have said that a stone wall for 3,000 inhabitants takes 3 years to build. But no engineer on the continent had a lord who could see through the earth. Alden pointed out to Marin a vein of bedrock half a mile from the city where the rock lay in ready-made, even slabs that needed no hewing, only separation and transport. He pointed out a vein of lime for the mortar. He pointed out, directly beneath the line of the future wall, dry voids that needed to be filled before laying the first row, and Marin, listening to this, shook his head and said that for such geological reconnaissance, any crown would pay by weight in gold, yet here it was being given for free in a single evening. Construction began in earnest within a week. Here are 300 refugees from the flood hauling slabs along wooden rollers, and Anna is feeding them right by the masonry from the carts.
Here, the first row of the wall winds around the well hill, and the boys are racing each other along it.
Here Marin is erecting the northern gate with 2 towers and hanging a piece of white metal from the underground city above the opening, simply because this metal is resistant to both rust and acid. Here the wall closes into a ring a week before the first snow, and the entire city comes out to watch as the last slab is lowered amid shouts and whistles. Meanwhile, Dorn was turning 500 mercenary spearmen into an army. He drove them through the hills day and night, and he did so with the knowledge of a man who had served for 8 years under the very man who would now come to kill them. He told Alden straight out that 500 against 5,000 in the open field meant certain death, and that his expertise ended there. Alden replied that they would not go out into the open field, and that he had another location prepared for the Duke's army. He did not specify which one. Every night, the inner map showed him a breathing void beneath the coast, and every night he noticed something new. The void was breathing more frequently. At the beginning of winter, its edge rose once every 7 minutes. By midwinter, once every 5 minutes. The water in the coastal aquifers was receding further and further from it, and the wells in the Duke's port cities must already be running dry. Alden sent Joss with a trade caravan to Selvin with orders to eavesdrop on the sailors' conversations. Joss returned and confirmed it. In the Duke's ports, the water in the wells was dropping and becoming saltier. Fishermen complained that the fish had moved away from the shore, and at Ferranda Castle, the dishes had rattled twice that winter, even though the coastal land had not trembled in the memory of 6 generations. The Duke's men blamed these ominous signs on everyone from priests to smugglers. Alden was the only one on the continent who knew that the signs were coming from below, and there was only one thing he didn't understand: exactly what was awakening. He sought the answer where he was accustomed to seeking everything in the earth. The inscribed plate from the upper hall had been in his possession since the day of the first expedition, and now he ordered Marin to lead the way deeper into the passages that his map showed lay beneath the first tier. He was going underground himself. Rack cursed and demanded that the Lord not venture into a hole where no one could protect him. Alden replied that underground he could see better than all the bodyguards in the world combined. The second tier of the ancient city turned out to be not a storeroom, but a library. The halls were as dry as a summer day, and stone shelves stretched along the walls, holding thousands of tablets. Most of the inscriptions were indecipherable, but the ancients had left something else behind as well: maps. Cast metal maps of the continent on which Alden recognized mountain ranges and riverbeds, though the coastline was drawn differently. And on each of these maps, off the western coast, the same symbol was cast. A spiral, coiled inward, and crossed out by 3 lines. At the edge of one map, another point was marked with the same symbol, the Ash Hills. Only near the hills was the spiral, small and uncrossed. Alden pored over the maps until morning. He took upstairs the 3 plates on which the symbol appeared most frequently and ordered a search of all the caravans for anyone who could read ancient script. The answer came from an unexpected source. Among the refugees from the flood, a quiet old man named Tobias had been living for half a year. He mended children's shoes, and no one ever asked him anything. Upon seeing the plate on the table in the Lord's chamber, where he had been brought to mend Dorn's boots, the old man dropped his awl. He said he had been the keeper of the archives at the Temple of the Old Faith until the temples were closed, and that he had transcribed these writings in his youth, 40 years ago. He read slowly, syllable by syllable, as one reads a half-forgotten language. And what he read by spring changed everything for Alden. The ancients did not build the city beneath the hills as a dwelling. They built it as an observation post. The tablets referred to what lies beneath the coast by a word that Tobias translated as the sleeping tide. The ancients wrote that the sleeping tide is neither a beast nor a spirit, but water that cannot be. The sea sealed beneath the stone in a war beyond counting and locked there by the combined labor of all the ancient cities. The tablets stated that the barriers would stand as long as the anchor stones stood, and they listed the anchors by symbols. A crossed-out spiral meant a broken anchor, an uncrossed-out one meant an intact anchor. Of the continent's 11 anchors, 10 were crossed out on the most recent map. Only one remained intact, beneath the Ash Hills. Tobias finished reading, and for a long time, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the lamp burning snake fat. Rask asked what would happen if the last one broke. Tobias turned the tablet over and read the ancient's answer, word for word. The sea will remember its shore. Alden looked at the inner map, where, beneath the ducal ports, a void the size of a duchy was breathing, and now he understood its breath. It was not a creature tossing and turning in its sleep. It was the imprisoned sea testing the strength of the last castle. And this castle stood beneath his city, beneath his well, beneath his wall, which had just been completed. That very night, he realized something else, the worst part. The void was breathing more frequently and not of its own accord. Every surge of its breath on the map coincided in time with the work of Firon's diggers. Over the winter, the Duke never abandoned the southern shaft of the buried city. His engineers had passed through the 4th and 5th collapses and were now blasting through the 6th with gunpowder, no longer in search of gold, but out of the sheer stubbornness of a man who had lost everything. And every blast echoed below through the slabs of the ancient floodgates, like a blow to the rim of a cracked jug. Without realizing it, Farrand was pounding away at the wall behind which lay the sea. Alden wrote a letter to the Duke. He wrote to an enemy who was mustering 5,000 troops against him, and he wrote without pride and without bargaining. He laid everything out, the slabs, the anchors, the breath of emptiness beneath the gates. He asked for only one thing: to halt work in the southern pit and send any trusted person to whom the hills would reveal the evidence. Joss delivered the letter himself under the white banner of the embassy. The reply arrived 2 weeks later and was 100 times shorter than the letter. Duke Firon informed the Lord of the Wasteland that he valued this new tale more highly than the previous ones because, with the previous ones, he had only frightened his neighbors, whereas with this one, he was attempting to frighten the sea. The reply ended with a date, the 15th day of the month of Thaw, the day when the Duke's army would march out to the hills. Alden placed the reply on the table next to the plate, where the spiral had been crossed out 10 times. 40 days remained until the 15th day of the month of Thaw, and he was the only person on the continent who knew that preparations were needed not for one war, but for 2, and that the second of them could not be won with spears. Over the winter, the hills had been fortified with a stone wall built based on Alden's geological surveys and Dorn's 500-strong army, and beneath the second tier of the buried city, an ancient library was discovered where the keeper Tobias read the truth. Off the coast lay an ancient sea known as the Sleeping Tide. It was held in check by 11 anchor, of which only one remains intact beneath the Ashen Hills. Meanwhile, Ferran's gunpowder operations in the southern shaft are undermining the locks and quickening the breath of the void. The Duke rejected Alden's warning and ordered a 5,000-strong army to march on the 15th day of the month of Thaw, 40 days hence. Alden divided those 40 days into 2 wars and devoted half of himself to each. The daytime war was a human one commanded by Dorn. The nighttime war was an underground one, and in it Alden had only Marin Tobias and a map that no one else had seen. He began with the nighttime war because it would decide everything. Tobias spent days on end poring over the tablets and found a hall in the library that the ancients called the House of the Key. According to the description, the anchor gate was not a single slab, but 40 slabs fitted together like scales, and the gate had a heart, a stone the size of a wagon, suspended in the current of underground water, dampening its impacts just as a breakwater dampens the force of waves. As long as the heart hangs level, the gate withstands any pressure. If the heart is dislodged or jammed, the gate will burst within hours. Alden found the heart using his map in a single night. It hung beneath the city at a depth of 300 paces, directly beneath the well square, and the water swirled around it in a slow spiral, the very same spiral from the ancient symbol. Now he knew what he was guarding and where it was. Marin was given his second insane task of the year, to drive a repair tunnel to the key house along the route that Alden would map out through the most solid strata, not to disturb the heart, but so that, on a dark day, they could reach it. Marin looked at the 300-step deep cut, spat, said that after this project he'd retire to repair children's whistles, and assembled 3 shifts of the quietest tunnelers. The war above ground was brewing openly. Alden reasoned that hiding the defenses from the Duke was pointless, because Ferran's spies traveled with the caravans just like all the merchants. He did the opposite. He showed the spies everything he wanted them to see. They saw a wall that could not be taken without a month-long siege. They counted 500 Dornish lances and 100 archers on the towers. They learned that the stone granaries held a year's worth of grain and that the well inside the walls was inexhaustible. Each scout carried the same calculations back to the coast. A siege of the hills would cost the Duke more than the hills themselves were worth. But Ferrand was not after the hills. He was after a man, and a man does not count grain. On the 15th day of the month of Thaw, the coastal army set out, and Alden's internal map turned into a river of dots flowing eastward. 5,200 men, 60 siege engines disassembled, a supply train of 700 wagons. The lands of Trial had never seen such a force, and the claimants of neighboring domains sent letters to Alden in which a single question shone through the politeness. When would the hills fall, and what would the neighbors get? Only Lady Maeve sent something different. 200 of her militiamen with grain and a 3-word note. Debts are paid on time. Alden stationed her men on the wall alongside his own and ordered them to be fed from the common pot. The Duke's army had been marching for 8 days, and Alden had been tracking its route by the water. 5,000 mouths and 4,000 horses drank as much as a small town, and Ferrand led the army from one water source to the next along a single thread of springs running alongside the old highway. Alden knew this route better than his own backyard. He did not poison the wells because, after the war, the survivors would have to drink from them. Instead, he reduced the flow. A week before the enemy's approach, Raska's men dug up and diverted 2 springs in the middle section of the road into drainage ditches, simply deepening their outlets, as indicated on the map. The springs did not disappear. They dwindled to a thin trickle. And when the Duke's army arrived at its planned campsite on the 4th day, it found a muddy puddle instead of a small lake. 5,000 men cannot be watered from a puddle. Ferrand was experienced and did not press forward without water. His column turned toward an alternate water source to the south, just as it was supposed to, thereby lengthening their journey by 2 days and entering a stretch of salt flats where there was neither grass for the horses nor firewood. Each such day cost the Duke 1,000 coins worth of fodder, and that was precisely what Alden was aiming for. He was waging war against the supply train, not the soldiers. On the 11th day, the coastal army reached the foothills, weary and angry, and set up camp a mile from the southern gate. Ferrand proved to be a man of action, no negotiations, no heralds. By evening of that very first day, his engineers had begun assembling the siege engines, and the diggers had brought the first sap to the wall. And there, Alden's daytime war met his nighttime war, for the Duke's sappers had begun digging into the ground, in that very same ground that Alden had surveyed down to the last crack. Dorn received a sheet of paper from the Lord on which all 6 trenches, which had only just begun to be dug, were mapped out with pinpoint accuracy, down to the step, and with notes on the depth at which each would pass through quicksand or a dry cavity. Then began a battle that the Duke's sappers would remember for the rest of their lives. No matter where they directed their tunnel, counter mines struck them from the darkness. The defenders of the hills found themselves in underground tunnels before the attackers did, as if they had been digging them for years. Quicksand flooded the sap tunnels through precise holes made exactly from above. The vaults collapsed from the tunnels dug day after day. In 2 weeks, the Duke lost more men underground than he had in other field battles, and his sappers began to refuse to go down into the tunnels, whispering among themselves that a master lived beneath the hills who could see right through the stone. They were literally right, and because of this, the rumors only spread more widely. The Duke's machines pounded the wall for 20 days. Marin's stone slabs crumbled, and at night Marin would rearrange them amid curses, but the wall stood because it was set on a solid foundation and had not a single void beneath it. On the 21st day, Ferrand changed his plan. An internal map showed Alden that a detachment of 600 men with a small supply train was heading north from the Duke's camp. They were heading for the Selvin Pass. Having failed to take the city, the Duke decided to cut off its supply lines, the trade route. The blockhouses at the pass were manned by 50 riflemen, and they stood no chance against 600 men. Dorn asked for permission to launch a sortie and intercept the detachment in the hills. Alden refused. He looked at the map and saw what Dorn did not. The Duke's 600 men were heading for the pass by a shortcut through the upper reaches of the dry ravines, and in the ravines, after the autumn rout, the Crimson Horde was gathering once more. Young snakes from the latest clutch had taken over the old gullies, and there were now far more than 40 of them, 150 in all. Alden sent a single messenger to the pass with orders for the archers to abandon the blockhouses without a fight and lead the men to the Selvin side, but he sent no one to the Balky. This time, not even smoke was needed. 600 entered the upper reaches at sunset, set up camp directly above the wintering gullies, and lit bonfires. The heat of the fires took care of everything. The night over Balke was filled with screams until dawn. The next morning, the internal map showed Alden 300 dots fleeing back toward the Duke's camp in disarray and without their supply train. The pass remained intact. The archers returned to the blockhouses by noon, and throughout the coastal army, it was no longer a rumor, but a named terror that was spreading. The soldiers said that the Lord of the Hills commanded the creatures of the earth and that the war was not being waged against a man. The priests in the camp held prayer services. 300 mercenaries packed up during the night and left without asking for payment. Ferrand hanged a dozen deserters, thereby only confirming the fear. On the 35th day of the siege, the Duke's camp ran out of fodder, and the horses began to die off. On the 38th day, Alden, standing on the tower at night, sensed something that no one else in either army had felt. The slabs beneath his feet trembled almost imperceptibly. The inner map flared up. The breath of the trapped sea broke from its rhythm. The void beneath the coast swelled into a long wave, rolled eastward beneath the continent, and struck the final anchor at the heart of the loch beneath the well square. The heart swayed. The spiral of water around it went haywire, moving in jerks, and only settled down a quarter of an hour later. And far to the west, that very same night, the sea near the Duke's ports receded 300 paces from the shore and returned in a small wave that pushed the fishing boats onto the docks. Alden came down from the tower and woke Moraine and Tobias. He told them that the repair tunnel was no longer operating under peacetime conditions. He said that the hills had already won the human war because the Duke's army was dying of hunger and fear at their walls, and he said that it meant nothing, because the real enemy had just reached the door for the first time. The heart of the last anchor gate had been found, hanging in a spiral of water 300 paces below the well square, and Moraine was secretly driving a repair tunnel toward it. The siege by Ferrand's 5,000-strong army has failed. Alden wore down the enemy by diverting the keys along the highway, routed all 6 SAP teams knowing their locations from the map, and the 600-man detachment sent to the Selvin Pass was annihilated by 150 young serpents in Sukiabalki, after which the Duke's army is being consumed by hunger and a mystical terror. But the surge of the trapped sea struck at the heart of the fortress for the first time, shaking it, and the sea near the Duke's ports receded from the shore overnight. The morning of the 39th day of the siege began with a white plume rising above the coastal camp. Pharaon requested negotiations, and Alden agreed to a meeting between the wall and the camp in a tent set up exactly in the middle. The Duke arrived with 4 men, and Alden saw the enemy up close for the first time. Pharaon was in his 50s. A gaunt man with the face of an accountant and the eyes of a gambler who had been losing for 2 months straight and knew it better than anyone. He wasted no words on titles. He said he was lifting the siege because the war had devoured 3 years' worth of the treasury, but had not devoured the walls. He offered peace on the terms of a trade. The hills would receive passage along the western trade routes and to the ports, while the Duke would receive a quarter of the toll from the Selvin Pass and a commitment from the hills not to build a second pass further north. These were the terms of a loser pretending to negotiate, and both men understood this. Alden replied that he agreed to everything except one thing, and that in exchange for a quarter of the toll, he was asking for something that would not cost the Duke a single coin. He asked that the southern excavation above the buried city be halted permanently, and that his men be allowed access to the site to fill in the upper landslides. Pharaon leaned back in his chair and stared at him for a long time. He asked if the Lord of the Hills was still clinging to the fairy tale about the sealed sea. Instead of answering, Alden placed 3 items on the table: a cast map of the ancients with spirals, Tobias's notes with a translation, and a sheet with his own notes, where he had recorded the dates and times of all the tremors over the winter, alongside the dates and times of the blasting operations in the shaft, which he had plotted on his map. He told the Duke that he could verify the last column against his own engineer's logs. Pharaon took the sheet. He read it the way one reads ledgers, quickly and skimming through. Then he froze on a single line. Alden knew which one. On that night, when the sea was receding from the ports, there had been no blasting operations in the shaft, but there had been a tremor, and Alden had recorded it down to a quarter hour. No one in the siege camp could have known about the receding sea. News from the coast took a week to arrive. Pharaon slowly put the sheet down. He asked where it came from. Alden replied just as he had replied to Marin and Maeve. He said that he saw deeper than others, and that the Duke was free to consider it witchcraft, a fairy tale, or a gift, but that he was obligated to check his engineer's logs. Pharaon was silent for a long time. Then he said that the wells in his ports were running dry, that his astrologers were lying to his face for a fee, and that for the past 2 months he had been at war with a man who had never once gone into battle and had never once made a mistake. He said he didn't believe in a sealed-off sea, but he also said that the rules of the game wouldn't allow him to bet against someone who never makes a mistake. He would halt the excavation. He'll allow people access to the landslides, and through his contact at the Court of Trials, he'll arrange everything as a gesture of goodwill toward a new trading partner. By evening, the peace treaty was signed in the square by the well in front of the people, and Koldon, who had arrived as a witness from the council, read the terms aloud. When he reached the clause about free trade routes, the square roared so loudly that pigeons took flight from the eaves. The coastal army broke camp and headed west, hauling away dismantled machinery and 3,000 tales about the Lord who can see through the earth. Standing on the tower, Dorn watched them go and told Rash that throughout the entire war, the Hills had lost 11 men, and all 11 were buried underground in the countermines. Rash replied that he still didn't understand who he was serving, but he wouldn't change sides. The city breathed a sigh of relief, and Alden gave him exactly 1 scene's worth of respite. A week-long fair in honor of peace, to which caravans from half the continent had converged. As for himself, he barely left the tunnel that week. Marin had driven the tunnel to a depth of 200 paces and hit the horizon that Alden had feared from the very beginning. The floating layer, a layer of water-bearing sand 12 paces thick that cannot be penetrated with ordinary fortifications. The ancients used to pass through such horizons by freezing them with a mixture from their storerooms. But over thousands of years, the mixture had dried into stone. Tobias searched the library for a recipe. Marin tried cast iron rings. The tunnel came to a standstill. And the heart of the lock below never regained its former rhythm after the spring tremor. The spiral of water around it had narrowed to a hair's breadth, and Alden saw this every night and measured that hair's breadth every night. In the summer, what he had been waiting for, and feared more than an army, arrived. The tremors began without any gunpowder. The locked-up sea now swayed on its own, gathering momentum just as a bell's clapper gathers momentum. The intervals between the tremors shortened from weeks to days. On the coast, people no longer attributed the signs to a bad year. Over the summer, the Duke's ports had weathered 3 low tides and 2 storm surges. And after the second surge, which had washed away the Pharaon warehouses, he sent a letter to the hills, unsealed and without titles. The letter contained 3 words. You were right. And following the letter, the Duke sent something more valuable than 5,000 soldiers. His engineers from the southern excavation site, every last one of them, led by a foreman named Cassell, who had spent 20 years building piers and breakwaters in ports, and complete logs of all the work and all the tremors over the past 2 years. Cassell went down into the tunnel, looked at the quicksand around Maran's cast iron rings, and said that he had seen such a strata in harbor construction and that it was penetrated using an air-pressurized caisson. He said that the method would kill 3 out of every 10 tunnelers, and that it wouldn't be done any faster than a year anyway. That same evening, Tobias brought a plate from the library that had been found in the pharma's cell. On it was a drawing made by the ancients themselves, a repair tunnel leading to the House of the Key. The ancients had built it long ago, and their passage bypassed the quicksand in a spiral along a rocky ridge that wasn't marked on any of Alden's maps, because the map showed him water, ore, and voids, but didn't indicate the boundaries of the rock formations. The blueprint provided the missing piece. Alden superimposed the ancient spiral onto his map and saw that half of the old passage was still intact. 40 paces of solid rock separated Marin's 88 from it. 40 paces instead of a year's worth of caisson work. Work proceeded in 4 shifts, and while the rock was being blasted below, Alden was assembling the second army of this war above ground, an army for the war against water. Through Pharaon and Selvine, he hired not spearmen but carpenters, masons, and shipbuilders. Maeve sent Marin a team of her dam building experts to assist him. Holden secured a decree from the council requiring all the domains of the trial to send men for public works because Alden had shown the council Castle's calculations. If the last barrier were to break, the wave from the trapped sea passing beneath the continent would raise all the rivers at once, and the flood of Halda would seem like a puddle after the rain. The council did not believe in the ancient sea, just as Pharaon did not, but the council, like Pharaon, did not dare to oppose someone who had never been wrong. By fall, Alden had 11,000 men from 20 estates working under his command, and this was a force the trial had never mustered, not even for war. Garrick, who had arrived with a convoy of workers from his flood-ravaged estate, stood in the well square, looking at Marin's tower, at the wall, and at the people from 20 lands working together in the same crews, and told Joss that a year ago he had laughed at the surveyor louder than anyone else. Joss replied that everyone had laughed, and that laughter had a short memory, while water had a long one. On the first day of fall, a rocky ridge collapsed under the pickaxes, and Marian's tunnel joined the passage of the ancients. Alden went down first. The spiral passage wound downward, smooth as a seashell, and after 300 paces led to a hall that could not have existed. A vault 30 human heights high. The walls were made of slabs fitted together seamlessly. And in the center of the chamber, in a circular depression, stood water swirling in a slow spiral. And within that spiral, suspended without touching anything, hung a stone the size of a wagon, the heart of the last lock. It was intact. But running down its side from top to bottom was a fresh crack as wide as a palm. And with every distant tremor of the trapped sea, stone dust trickled out of the crack and flowed into the spiral of water, just as blood flows into a river. Pharaon lifted the siege, signed a peace treaty granting free passage, and after Alden's records matched the logs of his engineers, he halted the southern shaft, and the summer tremors and waves crashing against the ports forced the Duke to acknowledge the hill's validity and send engineers led by Master Castle. The Council of Trials, by decree, assembled 11,000 men from 20 domains for the general works. They aided bypassing the quicksand along the by Tobias, closed with a spiral passage, and Alden reached the chamber at the heart of the dam, where the rock was intact, but a fresh crack, a palm's width wide, ran through it, growing with every tremor of the trapped sea.
The crack was measured every day, and every day it grew by the thickness of a fingernail. Based on his experience as a dock worker, Cassel Castle calculated that a stone with such a rate of cracking would hold out for 100 to 140 days.
Tobias combed through the library down to the very last page and found the records of the gatekeepers, which the ancients had kept right up until their very end. The records broke off mid-sentence, but before they ended, the gatekeepers had managed to describe the essentials, how the gate was constructed and how it was dying. The heart could not be replaced because no other stone like it existed. The heart could not be propped up because any firm touch would disrupt the spiral of water. The gate would begin to tear apart under its own pressure. The ancients wrote that the heart could only be relieved of its load by diverting part of the impact away from it. The entire system of 11 anchors was built for this very purpose. 11 hearts divided the breadth of the imprisoned sea into 11 parts, and each carried its share with ease. Now, a single stone bore all 11 parts. After reading the translation, Kessel said aloud what Alden had already figured out for himself. They needed to restore at least one broken anchor to working order and relieve the last one of half its load. According to the ancient maps, the nearest broken anchor lay 200 miles to the west, beneath the lands everyone called the Doomed Plain, a scorched patch 40 miles across, where no grass grew, no beasts lived, and not even fugitives dared to venture. Alton turned his inner gaze toward the bald spot and saw the cause of both the dead land and the crossed-out spiral. The anchor hall there had not been destroyed by time. It had been blown up from within during an ancient war, and through its breach, something seeped up from the depths, something that Alden's map showed as water, but not ordinary water, heavy water. It stood in the rock as a dead, bitter horizon from which the bald spot had been scorched. The heart of that sanctuary lay intact at the bottom of the ruined hall. The ancients built hearts to last for centuries, and the explosion had dislodged the stone from its spiral, but had not shattered it. The task seemed simple and sounded like a death sentence. Reach the dead hall through the poisoned horizons, lift a stone weighing 4,000 poods, and return it to the spiral that was still spinning idly beneath the breach. Marin said he would lift such a weight using gates and pulley systems if given half a year. Castle said that with Caisson's support, he could divert the bitter water if given a year. Alden replied that they had 100 days for everything and left the underground hall because for the first time during the trial, he didn't know the answer. The answer came from above, from the square. By then, the city knew the truth. From the very start of the work, Alden had forbidden lying to the people, and on the well square next to Selvin's prices hung a board where Tobias wrote once a week in simple terms what was happening below and how many days were left on Cassel's count. The people accepted this as one accepts a doctor's verdict. At first, the city fell silent for a week. Then it went into double time. And one evening, 3 men came to see Alden. Bertolf, with a broken arm, Anna's eldest son, who in 2 years had grown into a broad-shouldered foundry worker, and Captain Dorn. Bertolf placed a bar of the ancient white metal on the table. He said that for 2 years, in secret from everyone, he had been experimenting with this metal in his smelter, and that the metal does not melt in a furnace, but can be forged if heated in snake fat. He said that it could be used to make chains and axles unlike any the world's lifting gates had ever seen, chains that would not break even under a load of 8,000 poods. Anna's son said that the foundry was ready to cast blocks and gears day and night, and Dorn said something that made the room fall silent. He said that the first to enter the bitter waters would not be the workers chosen by lot, but he himself and his 42 former wolf cloaks because they had sworn an oath to science. And here it is, science. To go where no one else will go. The 100 days turned into a montage that not a single participant could later recount coherently. Here is a convoy of 600 wagons leaving the hills to the west, and Alden himself leads the column across the dead land because only his gaze finds in the bald lands the thread where the bitter horizon lies, deepest of all. Here, Castle erects a caisson tower over the breach in the Hall of the Dead, and Dorn's first shift descends under pressure, wearing bone masks soaked in Tobias's concoction based on ancient recipes. Up above, 60 horses and 800 men in 4 shifts turn Marin's gates, while Bertolf's white chains stretch into the breach, link by link without breaking. On the 40th day, the first of those poisoned are brought up from the caisson, and Maeve's healers give them milk mixed with charcoal to drink. Half of them recover, while the other half do not. On the 71st day, the heart of the dead dam breaks away from the floor of the hall, and the entire camp outside hears from beneath the earth a rumble as if the stone itself had sighed. And so Alden, without leaving the caisson for 3 days, guides the stone by word and by the palm of his hand, because only he sees the spiral of idle water, and only he can say by what hair's breadth to shift 4,000 poods. And so, on the 74th day, the stone enters the vortex, the water catches it, guides it, spins it, and takes its entire weight upon itself down to the last pound. No one in the caisson shouted with joy because you can't shout while wearing masks. Dorn simply sat down on the stones where he had been standing and sat there for a long time. Up above, they learned the result an hour later, and the camp of 800 people roared with celebration until midnight. And 200 miles to the east, in a hall beneath the well platform, Marin's shift supervisor was the first to see what it had all been for. With another jolt from the trapped sea, the spiral of the last heart swayed half as gently as usual. The second anchor took its share. The crack did not close, but its rate of expansion slowed from a fingernail's width per day to a fingernail's width per week, and Castle's count shifted from 100 days to years. The convoy was returning home through the lands of the trial, and it was greeted as no victorious army had ever been. People stood at the fords with bread. Garrick brought all his possessions out to the road and silently bowed to the column at the waist. In the capital of the trial, the council came out to meet them in full force, and Holden read aloud the decree declaring the Ash Hills the first domain of the continent and granting Lord Alden investigative authority to oversee all the anchor lands. Ferrand, who had sent 2,000 of his men to work on the project, wrote briefly, as always, "The ports stand. The sea sleeps more peacefully. Duty lies beyond the coast." Alden listened to all this while standing on a wagon next to Dorn, whose voice had been permanently ruined after the caissons, and he wasn't thinking about the decrees. He was thinking about the 19 names that Tobias had already carved onto the slab by the well. 19 men had not returned from the bitter waters, and at the top of the list was the name of old Bertolf, who had gone down into Caisson to repair his own chain, and whose broken arm had caused him to slip on the ladder. Victory had once again presented the bill, and the bill was once again higher than before, and a month after their return, the next installment of the bill arrived. That night, Alden was awakened by the watchman from the adit. In the chamber of the last heart, dust had stopped flowing from a crack in the rock. Alden went down and saw for himself. The crack was dry and silent, but the spiral of water around the heart had changed its sound. A second tone had been added to the steady rustle, a faint one, rhythmic. As if somewhere very deep beneath the spiral, something were tapping on the slabs of the barrier from the inside, steadily, patiently. Alden turned his inner gaze downward, beneath the heart, to a depth he had never looked into before, because there had always been only the solid blackness of the sealed-off water. The blackness was gone. Beneath the sluice gate, deep within the sealed sea, his map now showed dots, even chains of moving dots. His map had always shown only one thing like this, the living. In 100 days, the combined forces of the continent, under Alden's command, made their way across the poisoned, dead plain to the ruined anchor hall, where, using Kossel's caissons, Marin's gates, and Bertolf's white metal chains, they lifted the 4,000 pud heart and returned it to its idle spiral, relieving half the load from the last sluice gate. The crack's growth slowed from a fingernail's width per day to a fingernail's width per week. The hills were declared the continent's first territory, with the right to oversee the anchor lands, but 19 people perished, including Bertolf. A month later, beneath the last sluice gate in the depths of the sealed sea, Alden's map showed for the first time smooth chains of moving dots, the only way she marked the living. Life in the sealed sea moved in formation. Alden pored over the inner map for 3 nights in a row, and by the third night he knew more about the underworld than he would have liked to know. The dots moved in chains of 10 and 12. The chains converged on the barrier from different sides and diverged back with the regularity of shifts at a smelter. They didn't dart about like a beast in a frenzy, nor did they stand still like fish. They were working, and the tapping on the slabs that Marin's shift had heard coincided with their approaches, blow for blow. Something down there had survived in confinement for thousands of years, and that something was methodically tapping on the gate, just as a mason taps a wall in search of a weak joint. Alden convened a small council of those who knew everything: Marin, Castle, Tobias, Dorn, Rask, and Joss. By then, Tobias had pored over everything in the library concerning the War of the Ancients and laid out on the table the ultimate truth, which he had previously dismissed as a scribe's legend. The ancients had not sealed off an empty sea. The tablets of later years referred to those who remained below with the word that Tobias translated as ebb, not the name of a people, but the name of their fate. The ancients called their own ebb. Those who, in the last war, sided with the depths, chose water over stone, and were sealed away along with the sea when the gates rose. The guardians of the last generations wrote that they heard a knocking from below and argued about it until the end of the archive. Some considered the knocking to be the work of those trapped inside. Others, a prayer. Still others, a way of keeping time. The archive cut off mid-line, and the reason for its abrupt end was not named in the tablets. Castle asked the chief engineer, "Could the tapping from below break through the gate?" Alden replied, referring to the map, "The gate plates are 40 layers thick, and during a month of observation, the sensors at the bottom didn't detect a single one." But they aren't even trying to break through. They're tapping and listening. They're not looking for a weak spot. "They're looking for an answer," Dorn said in his hoarse voice that in 8 years of war, he'd learned one rule. If an unfamiliar force approaches your wall and doesn't scale it, it means they want to talk, and it's better to find out what they're talking about before they get tired of waiting. The council was divided. Rask demanded that they muffle any knocking and fill the upper horizons with rubble because what the ancients had sealed off wasn't sealed for no reason. Tobias objected that the ancients had also sealed off the sea, and that he and Alden had been saving the sea from breaking through for a year now, so perhaps the rest of the ancients' decrees were worth examining rather than blindly following. Alden listened to everyone and looked at the map, and on that very map, that same night, something happened that settled the dispute for the people. The chains of dots at the bottom rearranged themselves. They gathered right at the heart of the seal into a perfect ring and froze in place. And then the knocking changed. Instead of a steady tapping from below, a rhythm began. 3 knocks, a pause, 7 knocks, a pause, and 3 again. Tobias, upon hearing the rhythm recorded by the guards on duty, turned pale and pored over his lists. 3 and 7 were the greeting numbers of the overseers. According to the archive's regulations, the shifts in the vault chambers would tap to each other through the slabs when they met at the boundary. Down below, they remembered the regulations. Down below, it wasn't the breakers who came to the gate. Down below, it was those who considered themselves the relief shift. Alden made a decision that Rasch would later call, for a year, the craziest act of a mad lord. He ordered a response. According to the regulations from Tobias's archive, the shift on duty tapped the custodian's reply number into the slabs. 5 and 5. Down below, there was silence for a day, and after a day, the ring of dots broke open, and a single dot rose from it toward the gate. 1. And a new tapping began, slow, with long pauses. Tobias lived in the gate hall with the code plates for 3 weeks, and at the end of the 3rd week, he said that these were not signals. It was the watchman's tapping alphabet, and they were speaking through it from below. The conversation through 40 layers of stone went on for months, and each phrase took days. But from these phrases, a picture emerged that made the little council's faces change, just as Joss's face had once changed above the first well. Below lived the descendants of the imprisoned. They did not remember the war, nor did they remember guilt. They remembered the charter, for thousands of years. Their people had lived in the air pockets of the depths near warm springs, raising their children in the darkness, and the entire meaning of their world rested on a single legend. Up above, there are the Watchers. The Watchers here? When the time is right, the Watchers will answer and open the way. They had been tapping on the gates for generations. The 10 anchors were silent because the 10 anchors were dead. And only now, when Alden returned the second heart to the spiral and the gates began working again as a single machine, did their knocking travel for the first time through the revived connections and be heard. According to their elders' count, there were about 4,000 of them down below, and their world was dying. The warm springs of the depths were cooling century after century, and the last 2 generations of the imprisoned lived by the last 3 springs out of the 40 that once existed. The breath of the sea, which had nearly torn the barrier apart, was not merely the play of the water. The imprisoned ones themselves were rocking the depths, trying to make themselves heard, because they had only 2 human centuries left, or perhaps even less. The Council of the Hills sat over the calculations until morning. Cassel counted aloud, and his tally was terrifying. The gate cannot be opened. Any open passage would be claimed by the trapped sea within hours, and the wave would destroy the coast. We cannot leave it closed either because there are 4,000 living people down there, and they share a single legend. And despair does to nations what it does to individuals. If those trapped inside realize that the Watchers are responding but not providing a way out, they will stop knocking and begin shaking the depths. No longer just to communicate. Dorn summed it up in military terms. Negotiations with a besieged party that is stronger than you can only lead to one thing, the corridor. We need a path for the living that won't become a path for the sea. Once again, they sought the answer in two places at once, in the library and in the earth. Tobias pulled up a section from the distant hundreds that the Watchers called the Books of the Small Gates and found there something he himself could not believe at first. The ancients had built sluices within the gates, stone wells with double gates through which shifts of Watchers once descended to their work. A person can pass through. There is no sea. All the sluices were completely sealed with stone during the last war by order of those same ancients, but the blueprints remained, and Alden cast his inner gaze along the entire chain of anchors and began searching for a sealed sluice that could be reached alive. There was no sluice beneath the hills. Beneath the doomed bald hill, the lock had been destroyed by an explosion. He let his gaze wander further north along the dead anchors, across lands he had never set foot on. And beneath the eighth anchor, 400 miles to the north, beneath the mountains people called the Ridge of the World, his map revealed an entire lock chamber, filled with rubble from top to bottom, just as the books described, but intact, and the spiral of the eighth heart stood idle beside it, waiting for the stone, just as it had waited when that spiral beneath the bald mountain. Alden looked north and saw the full extent of the new challenge. Raise the third anchor, cross the mountains where no caravans venture. Dismantle the centuries-old rubble of the sluice without breaking the gate. Negotiate by tapping through the stone with a people whom no living soul had ever seen. And all this before the people below ran out of their warmth or patience. Joss, looking at the map, said that every time his lord solved one problem, the earth rolled out the next one, even bigger. Alden replied that this is what any road looks like if you walk along it without stopping. In the morning, he brought his decision out of the dungeon into the light. He gathered the town in the well square and told the people everything, just as he always had, about the knocking, about the 4,000 down below, about the cooling springs and the lock beneath the northern mountains. The square was silent for a long time. Then Anna stepped forward, aged by these years, and asked one question. "Are there children down there?" Tobias replied that, judging by the knocking, nearly half of those below were children. Anna turned to the square and said that, in that case, there was nothing more to discuss, and that she would be the first to sign her sons up for the northern convoy. The square buzzed with a murmur of agreement, and that evening a messenger from Ferrand rode in from the southwest with news that added a deadline to the northern route. For the third week in a row, the Duke's fishermen had been hauling in empty nets all along the coast. The sea off the coast was rapidly emptying of fish, and Alden was the only one who knew why. His map showed how the schools were moving away from the coast in circles, farther and farther out into deeper waters. The fish sensed something that humans had not yet sensed. The depths beneath the continent were beginning to breathe more rapidly once again. Those living in the sealed-off sea turned out to be the descendants of about 4,000 ancient followers of the depths, sealed away by their ancestors, along with their children who for generations have been tapping on the gates according to the Keeper's code, awaiting the promised path while their world is dying due to the cooling of the warm springs. Through tapping out the Keeper's alphabet, communication was established and a solution found. Beneath the crest of the world, 400 miles to the north, lies the intact, rubble-filled eighth anchor lock through which people pass but the sea does not, though to do so they must raise the third heart into an idle spiral and dismantle the centuries-old rubble. The city agreed to head north. Anna and her sons were the first to sign up, and the sea off the coast is emptying of fish because the depths are breathing more rapidly once again. The northern caravan was assembled in a month, and it was the largest caravan in the continent's history. 900 wagons, 7,000 people from the Duke's 20 domains and lands. Castle carried the dismantled caissons, Moraine carried the gates and the white chains, which, after Bertolf's death, the foundry workers had come to call the old man's chains. Tobias carried the books of the small gates, transcribed into 3 copies in case of disaster. Dorn led a guard of 1,000 spears, because the comb of the world was considered no man's land, and no man's land is never empty. Alden walked ahead and guided the column along a thread that only he could see. There were no roads through the mountains, but beneath the mountains lay water and rock, and his map pieced together a path from them, just as a bridge is built from prefabricated slabs. He led the caravan through valleys where warm springs lay beneath the snow, and the horses could drink. He guided the column around gorges where the map showed voids ready to come crashing down like an avalanche at the slightest shout. He found mountain passes unknown even to the mountain folk, because they sought the path with their eyes while he sought it through the rock. The journey took 40 days and unfolded in episodes that were later recounted around campfires across the entire continent. Here, the caravan stands for 3 days in a snowdrift, and Anna, along with Maeve's daughters, cooks soup for 7,000 mouths from the supplies Alden had calculated down to the last sack. Here, a mountain tribe of stone herders approaches the caravan with bows and leaves, without firing a single arrow, because Alden tells their elder where, beneath their encampment, lies the water they have been searching for 3 generations, and the elder himself leads the caravan across his pass. On the 38th day, the caravan emerges onto a plateau at the foot of the highest wall of the ridge, and Alden halts 7,000 people in the middle of a white desert where there is nothing but wind and says they have arrived. The people looked at the bare rock just as the first 11 had looked when they first reached the Ash Hills. And a week later, a city of tents stood on the plateau, complete with a smithy, an infirmary, and a well that they had dug, exactly as the Lord had said, into the only vein of meltwater. The 8th anchor hall lay beneath the plateau at a depth of 400 paces, and the journey to it took all of winter. Castle drove the inclined shaft in shifts of 100 men, and the rock of the ridge was hard to break but fair. No loose rock and no bitter water. The heart of the 8th lock was found exactly where the map indicated. It lay against the wall of the chamber, dislodged by an ancient tremor and intact just like the heart of Placia. The ascent, carried out according to established methods, took 20 days, and when the stone entered the idle spiral and the water bore its weight, the guards beneath the Ash Hills recorded that very same night that the breath of the depths had grown a third gentler. 3 of the 11 anchors were once again on duty. The lock was no longer dying. Now it remained to open it. The lock chamber stood 100 paces from the anchor hall and was exactly as described in the books. A stone tube, 4 carts wide, descending downward with 2 sets of gates, the upper gates and the lower gates, with a chamber between them large enough to accommodate up to 50 people at a time. The entire pipe, from top to bottom, was filled with lime-bound rubble, and over thousands of years the rubble had fused into a monolith. Castle examined the fill and said that dismantling it from above could only be done by hand, without gunpowder, because any explosion in the sluice pipe would shatter the gate rings, and then it would be goodbye to the sluice gate and goodbye to the coast. He calculated the time needed for manual dismantling. It would take 8 months. We didn't have 8 months. The echoes from the depths, which now traveled directly through the slabs of the 8th gate, brought increasingly dire news. The second of the 3 remaining warm springs of the lower people was cooling before their very eyes, and the elders of the depths relayed that they were leading the people to the last spring, and that the last spring wouldn't have enough warmth for everyone. Tobias translated their phrases, and his hands were trembling. The lower people did not ask them to hurry. The regulations forbade the overseers from rushing them. They simply reported the situation, just as a doctor at a patient's bedside reports the patient's condition. And then the lower ones found the solution themselves. One night, they tapped out a long phrase through the gate, over which Tobias sat until morning. The lower ones were asking for permission to work their way toward the entrance. Their foreman knew their end of the pipe. The lower gate on their side was free of rubble because they were pouring concrete into the pipe from above. They asked for permission to enter the lock chamber and dismantle the concrete pour from below while the men dismantled it from above. The Expedition Council argued all night. Rask argued that letting unknown people into the gate chamber meant giving them half the way up. Dorn replied that a people who had been following protocol for 1,000 years and asking permission to enter their own door deserved more trust than any neighbor in the trial. Alden decided, as he always did, by the map. He saw that the people below had gathered not warriors, but chains of laborers carrying loads at their gate, and that their children stood far behind, near the last source of warmth. That's not how an assault is organized. That's how a rescue is organized. He ordered them to tap out their consent. Work began on both sides of a single pipe and became the strangest construction project in human history. 2 peoples who had never seen each other once broke away a single stone toward one another and measured their convergence by the sound of the hammer blows. From above, shifts from Castle and Marin chipped away with pickaxes. From below, the masters of the depths chiseled it with an unknown tool, and the sound of their work rose up the pipe, steady and tireless as the flow of water. Every evening, both sides tapped out the count of feet covered, and Tobias recorded the total on a board by the forge, a figure that the entire plateau would come to read in the morning. The convergence figure became the camp's central prayer. In 2 months of working toward each other, they had covered the distance for which Castle had allotted 8 months. And on the night of the spring equinox, the pickaxe of a tunnel digger named Ard, son of Anya, vanished into the void. A warm, unfamiliar breeze blew up through the breakthrough from the depths. It smelled of salt, stone, and something else that no one up above knew. Work was halted. According to the code of the small gates, no one crosses the breakthrough first, the word goes first. Tobias went down to the breakthrough himself and tapped out the shift greeting from his book, and from the darkness beyond the breakthrough, for the first time, not through 40 layers of stone, but through an elbow's length of emptiness, a living knock answered him. Then the knocking fell silent, and from below came a sound that no human in this world had ever heard, a voice. A high, steady voice sang out words in an ancient language, and Tobias listened to them with tears streaming down his face because he understood them, word for word. The voice sang the formula for the warden's meeting, the very one that stood as the first line in the charter. "We have kept our part. You have come. One arch for all." Above the breach stood Aldendorn, Anna, and 50 tunnelers, and all were silent. Then Alden ordered the breach to be widened to its full width and the gate chamber to be prepared for the first ascent. He looked at the black breach from which a foreign warmth emanated, and his inner map showed how, on the other side, in the darkness, points stood in a chain, evenly, patiently, just as they had stood at the gate for 1,000 years. All that remained was to lift them up toward the light and not make a single misstep, because the map showed him something else as well. Far to the west, off the Duke's coast, the depths responded to the breach in the pipe with a long wave, and this wave was neither wrath nor disaster. For the first time in thousands of years, the locked-away sea swayed in its entirety all at once, like a sleeper sighing upon hearing through his sleep that the door had finally been opened. The northern expedition, numbering 7,000 men, had crossed the ridge of the world along Alden's invisible paths. It raised the third anchor heart into an idle spiral and opened the top of the flooded lock chamber, while the people below, having received permission, dismantled the filling from below to meet it. After 2 months of work from both ends, the pipe was broken through. Anna's son, Ard, made the first breakthrough, and through it came the living voice of the depths chanting the prescribed formula for the warden's meeting. The gate chamber was being prepared for the lower people's first ascent, and the sealed sea responded to the breakthrough with a single gentle wave. They spent 10 days preparing for the first opening, checking every step against the books of the small gates as one would check a prayer. The lock chamber held 50 people. The procedure was ancient, and Tobias insisted that it not be altered in any way. Those from below enter the chamber, the lower gates close. As the chamber is checked for water, the upper gates open. The people emerge into the light. Castle added only one thing of his own. He built a warm wooden hall above the mouth of the pipe, because it had become clear from their murmurs that the lower ones had never seen either the sun or snow, and that the light and cold of the plateau could kill them faster than any water. In 10 days, Anna and the women of the camp sewed 300 blankets from all the cloth in the supply train. Maeve's healers lit fires in the hall and prepared eye washes because Tobias had read in the later tablets that the eyes of the depths fear daylight. The first 5 to ascend were from below. This was at the request of the lower ones themselves, the elders of the clan, who, according to their reckoning, were responsible for everyone. The upper gates opened into the warm hall with the shutters closed, and standing in the chamber's doorway were those whom no living person had ever seen before. They were human. Everyone saw this, and many in the hall shuddered because, until the very last moment, no one had known whom to expect. Short, thin-boned, with skin as white as glass and enormous dark eyes that even the light from the hearts made them squint. Their clothing was woven from the fibers of blind algae, and hanging from their belts were tools made of bone and the same white metal that lay in the halls of the ancients. The eldest of the 5 stepped forward, and Tobias stepped toward him. The eldest was named Vesh. He spoke the language of the tablet slowly and with a sing-song intonation, and Tobias translated his words for the entire hall. Vesh said that their clan was known down below as the Keepers of the Count. He said that according to their elders' count, 1,420 generations of Nox had passed since the gates were closed. He asked permission to see those who held the upper hand. Alden stepped forward and identified himself as the keeper of the last anchor. Vesh looked at him for a long time with his dark eyes. Then he dropped to one knee, and his 4 companions did the same. He said that the charter mandated that one shift greet another, and that for 1,000 years, his people had argued about only one thing, whether another shift would ever come at all. Alden lifted him from his knee with his own hands and said through Tobias that the dispute of the depths was over. Then the ascent of the people began, and it lasted the entire spring. 50 at a time, 4 ascents a day. They went up in families, and the first thing done for each person brought up was to lead them into the warm hall, where they were allowed to get used to the hearths, the smell of wood, and the people of the surface. The children of the depths did not cry. They remained silent and watched, and this silence tore at the hearts of the women of the camp more than any crying could. Anna took charge of the entire warm hall and commanded it so effectively that even Dorn's spearmen obeyed her. A month later, the first families from the lower realm stepped out of the hall into the night sky. They were led out at night because the night was bearable for them. And the 7,000 people in the camp watched as the people of the depths stood beneath the stars for the first time. The people of the lower realm stood with their heads thrown back. And Vesh asked Tobias in a trembling voice what those lights were and how many there were. Tobias replied that no one had yet counted those lights, and then the people of the depths began to sing. All together from the elders into the children, one long note after another, and the mountains echoed their song. Later, Vesh explained that it was the song of counting. Down below, they used it to welcome each new year of darkness. Now, with it, they welcomed the sky. By summer, everyone had been brought up. 3,840 people, fewer than the elders of the depths had estimated, because the last winter by the cooled spring had taken its toll. The last to ascend were Vesh's 40 masters, who had held the lower gates until the very end and brought the books of the depths with them, bone plates recording the count of all generations. When the last of them emerged from the chamber, the gates were closed in full accordance with regulations, and Castle and Marin filled the upper third of the shaft with new rubble, leaving the chamber and the gate belts intact in case of need. The path remained open, the door was locked, and the sealed-off sea below continued to breathe evenly and softly, just as it had since the breach. And every night Alden checked this against the map, and every night found not a single sign of life in the depths. The people had all left. Now he had to decide where to live. And here Alden once again found himself at odds with everyone. The Council of Trials, which had sent envoys to the plateau, proposed dispersing the people from below in small groups across 20 domains so that no single entity would gain control of an entire people. Ferron had written to invite them to the coast, promising work in the ports. Even Holden cautiously remarked that an entire foreign people in one place would be a force that others would come to fear. Alden listened to everyone and asked Vesh himself what the depths wanted. Vesh answered the question with a question, just as the charter prescribed. He asked if there was a place on the upper land that was dark, warm, and deep, a place where their hands were needed, not merely tolerated. Alden smiled for the first time in many weeks. He knew of just such a place. The buried city of the ancients, beneath a hill 30 miles from the Ash Hills, had stood empty ever since the war with the Duke. Dozens of halls, the dry warmth of the deep rock, a library in a language the lower ones knew as their own, and thousands of works that none of the upper ones could produce, because the upper ones could not see in the darkness and could not read the tablets. Alden offered the keepers of the accounts the buried city as a permanent possession at the foot of the hills, on one condition, that the library remain open to both peoples. Vesh listened to the translation and said that the depths agreed and that the charter mandated that the treaty be sealed with work, not a seal. He asked what work the upper ones considered most necessary. Alden answered honestly. 8 of the 11 anchors are still dormant, and although the 3 active ones hold the gates securely, only a complete chain will remove the threat forever. The masters of the depths exchanged glances, and Vesh spoke words that Tobias translated slowly because he could not believe his ears. Vesh said that the keepers of the count had been preparing for this very moment for 1,000 years, that each of their generations had memorized the structure of the gates, the passages to the anchor halls from below, and the science of the spirals, that those above needed caissons, gates, and months to raise the heart, while the masters of the depths approached the anchor halls from below through the dry galleries of the watchers, galleries the books of those above make no mention of. He said that his people would return the 8 dead hearts to the spirals within 2 years if those above provided chains of white metal and bread. In the fall, the first joint expedition went underground toward the 4th anchor. 40 masters of the depths and 40 tunnelers from Castle, carrying Old Man Bertolf's chains. And on the plateau of the world's ridge, they were breaking camp, and Alden stood above the deserted mouth of the lock, looking south where the hills awaited him. He thought about how, for the first time in all the years of the trial, his map showed no sign of impending danger, no troops at the borders, no monsters in the ravines, no cracks in the rock, and this silence felt more unfamiliar to him than any threat. Joss, standing nearby, said he didn't trust the silence, and that behind every victory the Lord always exacted a greater price. Alden replied that this time, the price would not come from the map, it would come from the people, because a people who fear nothing begin to fear their neighbors. And he was proven right before he even left the plateau. A messenger from the council brought news. The 12 domains of the trial had submitted a joint petition. They demanded that the Grand Court be convened against Lord Ash Hills. The indictment took up a single sheet. Lord Alden had concentrated in his own hands the continent's trade routes, the army of the underworld, an ancient people, and knowledge beyond verification. The charter did not call this treason. The charter called it a question. Who is the man who sees everything and whom no one sees? Through the airlock, over the course of the spring, the entire people of the depths, numbering 3,840, were brought up, led by Elder Vesh. The gates were closed according to the charter, preserving the chamber, while the lower levels were granted in perpetual possession to the buried city of the ancients, with a library open to both peoples. The masters of the depths, familiar with the dry galleries of the keepers, undertook 2 years to return the 8 dead hearts to the spirals, and the first joint expedition set out for the 4th anchor. For the first time, Alden's map showed no threats. But 12 dominions submitted a charter convening the great court against him, asking who this man was, the one who sees everything, yet whom no one sees. The Grand Tribunal was convened in the capital of the trial for 3 months, and for all 3 months, the continent lived for this tribunal more than for the harvest. The Grand Tribunal was an institution older than the council itself. It had been convened twice in all of recorded history, and on both occasions, the lords on trial met their end at the block, because the Grand Tribunal did not judge actions. It judged the man himself. The 12 domains that had signed the charter appointed a common prosecutor, and the choice fell on someone no stranger to them, Master Holden. Alden received the news of this in the hills, and upon reading it, Dorn cursed in his hoarse voice for the first time in years. Holden knew the hills inside and out. Holden had witnessed every victory. It wasn't even worth traveling to face such a prosecutor. Alden convened a small council and said he would go, and go alone, without an army or a retinue, because a man who brought 1,000 copies to his own trial would confirm the charges before a single word was spoken. Rack demanded that he at least take a guard. Alden replied that his guard would be the same as it had always been, what he could see. The trial opened in the full within the stone circle of the capital, in the presence of all 22 lords, the duke's envoys, and such a gathering of the people that the capital's market streets were deserted. Vesh requested the right to stand beside Alden as a party to the proceedings, but the court refused because the people of the depths were not mentioned in any of the statutes. Then the keepers of the accounts did things their own way. 3,000 of them formed a silent ring outside the capital's walls, setting up camp in the field without entering the city. They simply stood there in silence, and that silence weighed on the court more heavily than any speech. Holden led the prosecution, just as he had conducted his audits all his life, without malice. By the record, he listed before the court that the Lord of the Hills controlled the sole passage for all goods from the east, that his army, having recruited veterans, was the strongest in the lands of trial, that under his command lay mineral deposits unknown to any or expert, that an entire people who had emerged from beneath the earth had sworn allegiance to him, that he foretells the tides of war and famine and has never once been wrong, and that the essence of the accusation is not that he has done anything wrong with this. The essence is that there is no power capable of testing him, stopping him, or even understanding him. Holden concluded with a question that left the circle speechless. He asked how a hidden gift differed from a concealed knife if a neighbor could know neither one nor the other. Alden defended himself, and his defense was brief. He did not deny a single line of the indictment. He said that everything listed was true, and that the truth went even further, and he did something no one expected. He offered the court the very test that Holden had demanded. He said he would reveal his gift to the court in its entirety, that he would describe aloud in the presence of scribes everything his map showed at any point the court might indicate, and that he was prepared to do this every year from now on before the council, because a hidden gift breeds fear while a shared gift brings benefit. The court deliberated and accepted the test. For 3 days in a row, Alden stood in the circle, and the lords named their lands to him, and he spoke. He told the lord of the western marches that coal lay 70 paces deep beneath his pastures and indicated the boundaries of the seam. He told the lady of the southern lakes that her fish weirs stood over stagnant water and that the fish would die by spring unless she moved them a mile to the east. He told Garrick where, beneath his restored terraces, a lens of rainwater had accumulated, threatening a landslide, and Garrick turned pale because he had seen the cracks on the upper terrace a week earlier and had not understood their significance. The scribes could not keep up with his words. By the third day, the lords were no longer cross-examining him. They asked him questions as one would ask a doctor, and then Holden rose to deliver his final statement of indictment, and everyone saw that he was holding not an indictment, but a blank sheet of paper. He told the court that he had conducted this prosecution honestly to the very end, and that the end had come. He said that the inventory was accurate, but that he had drawn the wrong conclusion from it. That for 3 days the court had been looking at the knife that had been recorded and had seen an open palm, and that he had one final argument left, which he was obliged to deliver not as a prosecutor, but as a human being. The gift lives in a single mortal body. Lord Alden had been impeccable in his stewardship of his gift, but Lord Alden would die, as everyone does, and then the continent, accustomed to living with its eyes open, would go blind in a single day, and that blindness would kill more than any war. Holden asked if the defense had an answer to death. Silence fell over the circle, and in that silence, Alden answered, yes. He said he had thought about this longer than he had about any war. A gift cannot be passed on, nor can it be bequeathed, but a gift can be transcribed. For 8 years, every evening, he transcribed his map onto stone and paper. The 400-sheet atlas of the continent's depths lies in the library of the buried city, and every sheet is certified by Tobias and the masters of the depths, the only ones who can verify it from below through their tunnels, all the veins, all the waters, all the voids, and all the anchors. He said there would be no blindness because sight had already been transcribed into the book, and he was bequeathing the book not to an heir or to a council, but to both peoples together for their common and indivisible possession. And finally, he said, the Charter of the Watchers, which the depths had preserved for 1,000 years, the upper ones have now adopted as their own. According to the Charter, a watcher has no dominion over what he sees. He keeps count and hands over the watch. His successor is already coming of age, for 3 years, under his guidance, 40 students from all the lands have been learning to count the depths, and the best among them is Ard, the baker's son, who has passed the ridge and broke through the final foot of the sluice. The gift will die with him. The knowledge will remain with everyone. The court withdrew to deliberate and returned faster than the midday stone of the circle had cooled. The eldest of the judges announced the decision. The Grand Court finds no threat to the lands and people in the Lord of the Ash Hills. The Grand Court finds a threat to the lands and people in themselves, unless the knowledge of one becomes the knowledge of all, and therefore the court neither acquits nor convicts but establishes. Henceforth, alongside the Council of Trials, there shall stand the Chamber of Reckoning, which safeguards the Atlas of the Underworld, trains overseers from all domains, and is headed for life by Lord Alden, and after him, by an elected representative from among the disciples. The circle rose to its feet, and what had begun as a trial of a man ended as the continent's oath to a new order. Holden was the last to approach Alden. He said he had lost this case just as he would have wished to lose every one, and that he was asking to be appointed the first scribe of the chamber because chronicling an entire life had been his craft, and now a worthy subject had been found. Alden took his hand. That evening, he stepped out of the stone circle, and the 3,000 keepers of the accounts standing in the field greeted him with the same long note with which they had once greeted the stars. And that night, at the capital's compound, he was awakened neither by a messenger nor by a knock. He was awakened by the map itself. Far to the south, beneath the fourth anchor, where the first joint attachment was working, the spiral came to life and accepted the stone. The fourth heart took its place in the ranks, and the locked sea, across its entire 1,000-mile depth, responded to this with a movement Alden had never seen before. It neither pulsed nor breathed. It slowly and uniformly subsided, just as the chest of a man who had been screaming for a long time and finally exhaled completely subsides. At the Great Court, the prosecutor Holden described Alden as a power that could not be verified, but a 3-day public demonstration of the gift before all the lords turned the court into a jury, and to the argument regarding the death of the bearer, Alden responded with a 400-page atlas of the Earth's depths, handed down to both peoples, and a school of 40 students, the best of whom was Ard, the son of Ona. The court established the Chamber of Accounts within the council, headed by Alden and an elected successor to follow him, while Holden asked to serve in the chamber as chief scribe. That night, the fourth heart rose in a spiral, and the locked sea began, for the first time, to recede everywhere, like a man who had exhaled. The sea's descent lasted 2 years, and during those 2 years, Alden slept less than he had during any war, for he saw what no one else had seen. The sea was not merely calming down, it was receding. With each new heart rising in a spiral, the pressure within the sealed mass dropped, and the water slowly sank back into the lower horizons from which an ancient war had once raised it. The Masters of the Depths confirmed this through their books. The barriers were built not as a prison for eternity, but as a temporary dam. The complete chain of anchors was meant not merely to hold back the sea, but, year after year, to press it downward into its native bed beneath the roots of the mountains. 10 generations of the ancients did not live to see this because the war had broken the chain. Now the chain was closing. The fifth heart was erected in winter. The 6th and 7th were built in spring when the deep-dwelling troops taught those from above how to navigate the warden's galleries, and the work proceeded twice as fast. The 8th arose by fall, right beneath the doomed bald spot on the far side of the ruined hall, and after it, what the Chamber of Accounts recorded as the first miracle of the new era took place. The bitter dead water of Plesh, deprived of its support from below, receded from the poisoned horizons in a single fall. And in the spring, at the edge of a 60-kilometer-wide patch where nothing had ever grown, for the first time in living memory, grass sprouted. The 9th heart proved the most difficult of all. Its anchor hall lay beneath the Duke's sea bay, and there were no dry galleries leading to it. Castle built the caissons directly from Pharaon's barges, and the Duke, 70 years old and already an old man, would come to the barges himself and sit there for days on end, watching as Marin's cranes lifted them out of the waters of his bay. He told Alden during the foundation work that he had spent his whole life counting money, but toward the end of his life he realized he had been counting the wrong thing. The 9th heart rose in a spiral after a year and a half of work, and in the coastal ports the water in the wells rose and became fresh for the first time in a decade. The 10th heart was found split in two. It was the only one of them all that had not survived the ancient war, and there was nothing to replace it with. The Council of the Chamber was preparing to remove the 10th anchor from the chain forever, but the answer was found in the library, where Tobias and the Elders of the Depths had by then deciphered the distant honeycombs. The tablets of the House of the Key stated that the chain was complete and divided into 10 parts if the spirals were redistributed, and they provided the calculations. For half a year, the Masters of the Depths restructured the water flow in the 9 halls according to these calculations and divided the 10th share among everyone. The chain closed without the 10th. The 11th remained. The last dead anchor lay furthest of all, in the far north beyond the ridge of the world, beneath the coastal cliff of the icy sea, and Alden had left it for last from the very beginning because the map showed something strange around that hall. The hall was intact. The heart lay whole by the spiral, but within the hall itself and in the galleries around it, year after year, the map still a single living dot, just one. The dot did not fade away or die. It moved through the hall day after day in a slow, set pattern, just as an old man moves through his house. They set out for the 11th anchor with a small detachment: Alden, Vesh, Tobias, Dorn, and 10 masters. The northern warden's galleries led them to the hall after a month's journey, and the detachment stopped at the hall's entrance slabs because the slabs were not blocked. They were locked from the inside with a working bolt, just as a door is locked by someone who is alive inside. Tobias tapped out the standard shift greeting. There was a long silence. Then the bolt slid back and the slabs opened. Behind them stood a man. He was old in a way that old people simply do not exist. His skin was whiter than that of the deep ones, and his eyes had faded to the color of ice. He wore the guardian's garb exactly as prescribed. He looked at the newcomers with a long gaze, then at Vesh, then at Alden, and he asked, in the language of the ancients, whether he understood correctly that the shift had arrived. His name was Ermin, and he was the last keeper of the old chain, not a descendant, a keeper. In the hall of the 11th anchor stood a machine of the ancients, which the tablets called the Long Sleep, and which the ancients themselves had managed to build only here in the far north during the final year of their war. The keeper would fall into a long sleep for a century and awaken for a year of service. Inspect the hall, lubricate the spiral, record the count, and lie down again. Irmun took up his post as a young man when the chain had already fallen and the 10 anchors lay silent. He was ordered to guard the 11th until the arrival of the relief, and he did so. According to his records, he had risen for a year of service 29 times. Tobias counted aloud, but could not finish the count because his voice would not obey him. By the time he had lived, Irmun was nearly 60 years old. According to the world calendar, nearly 3,000 years had passed. He listened to it all, about the fall of the ancients, about the upper peoples and the trial, about the imprisoned ones and their rise, about the 8 hearts returned to the spirals and the sea receding downward. He listened without interrupting for an entire day, and when Tobias finished, the old man remained silent for a long time, gazing at his spiral, which had been spinning idly for 3,000 years. Then he said that the caretaker's charter contained a line that everyone memorized but no one hoped to ever have to recite, the line for relinquishing the post, and that he was asking for permission to relinquish the post in full accordance with protocol. They all lifted the 11th heart together, and Irmin himself guided the stone the last few palm widths of the path, for he knew his spiral better than anyone in the world. When the water took the weight and carried the stone in a smooth circle, the old man stood at the edge of the chasm, straightened up, and recited the handover formula. The count was taken, the count was passed on, 1 vault for all, and the chain was closed. That very night, the entire continent felt it, though no one except the chamber understood what they were feeling. The earth did not tremble. On the contrary, the tremor that had lived within the earth for so long that people had come to regard as silence vanished. That night, wells and rivers heard the true silence of the earth's depths, and livestock in the barns lay peacefully from the ridge to the southern lakes. Alden stood above the spiral of the final hall and gazed inwardly at the entire 1,000-mile-thick expanse all at once. The trapped sea was now receding evenly along the entire chain, inexorably retreating into the depths from which it had risen. The chamber's calculations set the timeline. In 40 years, the upper horizons would be freed, and the continent's underground rivers would return to channels they had not known for 3,000 years. In 100 years, the last bitterness would leave the earth. The work was done. Irmin renounced his long slumber. He said he had slept enough and wanted to spend the remainder of his years with his eyes open. They took him south across the entire continent, and the last guardian of the ancients gazed upon the cities, the fairs, the children of the 2 peoples playing together in the squares of the buried city, and the wellboard of the hills where Selvin's prices were written in chalk. On the hills, the entire chamber and RDE, on behalf of the students, presented him with the first page of the new atlas. Irmin held the page up to his icy eyes for a long time. Then he said that for 3,000 years he had thought he was guarding a stone, but it turned out he had been guarding this. He died the following spring in his sleep in a warm room with windows facing the sunrise, and the 2 peoples buried him together according to both sets of customs at once. And a month after his funeral, Alden climbed Marin's tower one evening, sat overlooking his city, and for the first time in 11 years, allowed himself to survey the entire map, a full 1,000 kilometers, without any specific purpose. not looking for threats, not assessing resources, just looking. And he saw, across the entire map from edge to edge, only a living, active continent. And one thing he had never seen before because he had never looked like this, without a purpose. At the very edge of his vision to the east, beyond the sea that was considered the end of the world, the map showed a shore. Distant, foreign, inhabited. Over the years of work, hearts rose from the 5th to the 9th. The 10th share was redistributed according to the ancients' calculations after the loss of the split stone. And at the 11th anchor, the last living guardian of the old chain, Irmun, was found, having held his post for 3,000 years through a long slumber. He handed over his post according to the regulations. The chain closed completely, and the sealed-off sea flows inexorably downward, fully cleansing the lands over the course of a century, while Irmun died in the spring, in peace and honor. Looking aimlessly at the complete map for the first time, Alden saw, at the eastern edge of his vision beyond the sea, a foreign, inhabited shore. Alden didn't tell anyone about the eastern shore that night, and it was the first piece of news in 11 years that he didn't immediately bring to the square. He gazed at the distant points of alien life beyond the sea and tested himself with a question that, at some point, Holden had once asked him, how does a hidden gift differ from a concealed knife? In the morning, he convened the full chamber of accounts and laid everything out, a coast to the east, cities on it, because the dots stood in clusters, just as they do above cities, and an honest admission that his gaze could make out nothing else across the sea. No intentions, no ships, no souls. The chamber debated for a month. Dorn argued that an unknown shore always meant a future war and demanded that a fleet be built. Pharaoh, who had sent his heir to the debate, spoke through his son's mouth, saying that an unknown shore always meant future trade, and he, too, demanded that a fleet be built. Vesh spoke with the depth of words that settled the dispute. He said that his people had been knocking on a closed door for 1,000 years, and knew the value of those who answer and those who remain silent. If people live across the sea, then one day they will knock here, or hear a knock from here. And it is better to welcome them as the hills welcome the depths, with open gates and a ready charter. The council resolved to build neither a military nor a merchant fleet, but a diplomatic one, and laid the foundation for it in the free city of Selvin using funds pooled from the 20 domains of the duchy in the depths. Construction was scheduled to take 7 years, and as Alden listened to the timeline, he caught himself realizing that, for the first time, he was planning a project whose completion he might not live to see. He was 42 years old. His gift had not waned, but Alden remembered Holden's argument about the mortal body every day, and every day he responded to it in the only honest way. He passed it on. These years became years of passing on for the hills and the continent, and they flowed in slices through the seasons. Here is Ard, the first of the disciples to pass the chamber's full trial and without a teacher's help to draw a map of the underground of the entire domain, verified by the galleries of the depths down to the very last vein. Here is Anna opening a bread house on the well square for the orphans of the two peoples, and the children of the depths teaching the children of the surface to see in the dark, while the latter teach them to swim in the heated springs. Here is Rask, now aged and softened by compassion, handing over the city guard to Joss's son and retiring as a watchman in the library, for the silence of the tablets is the only silence he trusts. Here is Marin, who had promised to retire to the Whistling Birds but instead finishes building the shipyards in Selvan and rants there to the entire port that wood is stupider than stone. Here is Tobias, finishing the codification of the old and new statutes, and the council adopts it as the continent's universal code of law. And here, in the 8th spring since its launch, the embassy fleet, 9 ships white from sails to pennants, sails eastward from Selvin, and half the continent stands on the shores to see it off. It was not Alden who led the fleet, it was Ard. So had the council decided, and so Alden himself had requested, for the embassy to the New World must carry not the gift of a single man, but the knowledge of all. Young people sailed with Ard, Dorn's son, Maeve's granddaughter, and 2 youths from the depths, the first of their people to see the open sea, and the scribe from Holdon, who could no longer rise from his bed but dictated a single-line instruction to the ambassadors. Count honestly and aloud. The fleet returned a year and 3 months later, just as people were beginning to mourn it. It returned in full and not alone, and with it came 3 foreign ships with high dark sides and ochre-colored sails. The eastern shore turned out to be a land called Kairat, ancient. populous. It had survived the same ancient war from the other side and preserved mirror image legends of it. They had no enclosed sea. They had an enclosed flame beneath the southern mountains, and their guardians, extinct generations ago, had left behind a similarly fragmented code of conduct. Kairat greeted the White Fleet with caution, kept it there for a long time, but then let it go with the envoys because Ard had done on foreign shores what he had been taught in the hills. He brought them neither goods nor threats. He brought them a map of their own subsoil, compiled during a month-long stay, and on the map he showed their rulers where, beneath their fields, water seeps deep underground, water that causes them to lose a third of their harvests. Kairat's ambassador, a gray-haired dignitary named Taeyoon, stepped ashore on the Selvin and asked to be shown two things he had heard about the entire way: a well drilled into the dead hills and a man who could see through the earth. He was escorted across the continent, and he gazed in silence, just as the keeper of Irmin had once gazed, at the pass with its blockhouses, at the green edge of what had once been the doomed baldness, at the city of the depths in the halls of the ancients. And at the Ash Hills, which were now called that only out of habit, because over the past 20 years the gray slopes had been clothed in gardens fed by the underground river. At the well on Tai Un Square, he stopped and asked Joss, who was accompanying him, if it were true that it all began here, with a single hole in the dust. Joss replied that it had all begun earlier, on that day when an entire square had laughed at one man, while he remained silent and gazed into the depths. Alden received the envoy in the chamber, and they spoke for 3 days. Not about trade, though they did reach an agreement on that as well. Not about an alliance, though they signed that as well. They spoke of the locked-away flame of the South, and Alden gave Kairat the lists of all the books in the House of the Key, because the science of the locks was the same on both shores. As he was leaving, Taeyoon said that his country had considered itself alone in the world for 300 years, and that the loneliness of an entire country ends just as the loneliness of a person does, by someone answering the knock. That fall, Alden made the final move of his long trial. He convened a council of the Chamber of all Lords and Elders of the Depths, and in their presence, he relinquished his lifelong leadership, transferring the chamber to an elected body. Arda was chosen unanimously, and Anna wept openly in the square, unashamed before anyone. Alden remained in the chamber as a mere custodian, and when Holden asked in the Continental Court, he could now answer in full. Dar lived on in a single body, but knowledge lived on in the 400 pages of the Atlas, in the 40 custodians, in the galleries of the depths, and in the ships sailing east. No one was in danger of blindness anymore. And Alden himself lived out his life just as he had wished. He grew old in the hills among the people whom no one else had ever chosen, and who had built the world's first dominion alongside him. He lived to see the underground rivers flow into the channels of 3 millennia past, and how barges sailed along one of them, a new, bright river that had cleaved through the former wasteland. He lived to hold Anna's grandchildren and Vaish's great-grandchildren in his arms. And on his final evening as a very old man, he asked that his armchair be carried out to the ridge above the city, to the spot where he had once stood one night during the first week of the trial, foreseeing the impending calamities. Joss, who had outlived all the other elders, sat beside him. Below, the city glowed with lights. Caravans from the 6 lands and the 3 overseas realms stood in the saddle of the valley. Above the library, a window glowed, where the young watchers of both peoples kept the nightly tally. Alden opened his inner vision for the last time to its full range of 1,000 kilometers and slowly scanned everything he could see. Living rivers beneath the living earth, the spirals of 11 hearts rotating evenly, the sea withdrawn into its bed, roads full of dots and not a single one leading to war with anyone. He closed his eyes and told Joss that the map was clear. Joss asked what that meant. Alden replied with the words of the charter once spoken by the last keeper of the ancients, words now known by heart by every child of the 2 peoples. The count was kept, the count was passed on, one code for all. With these words, the first keeper of the new chain, Lord of the Wasteland, whom the entire square had once called a coward and a surveyor, departed as quietly as he had lived, and the city below carried on, and the water flowed beneath it, and hearts beat deep within. And somewhere on the 2 shores of a single world, at the very same hour, the young keepers recorded their nightly tally in the books, because this tally no longer belonged to a single person. It belonged to everyone, and therein lay the final outcome of the entire trial. The man who could see through the earth had achieved the most important thing. He taught the others to see. A diplomatic fleet of 9 ships under Arda's command discovered, beyond the Eastern Sea, the land of Kairat with a mirrored fate and a locked-away flame, and the two shores exchanged ambassadors, the science of locks, and treaties, while Alden handed over the leadership of the chamber to the elected Arda, remaining a simple watchman. The lands were healed, the rivers returned to their ancient channels, and Alden grew old among his people, having seen the fruits of all he had built. On his final evening, having ensured that the map was clean, he recited the formula for relinquishing his post and departed, while the custodians of the two peoples and the two shores continued to manage the resources of the underworld, for his vision had become the knowledge of all. The story is complete. All plot lines are closed.